I am Heather Raitt, the Program Manager for the Integrated Energy Policy Report, which we refer to as the IEPR. Today's workshop is being held remotely, consistent with Executive Orders N2520 and N2920, and the recommendations from the California Department of Public Health to encourage physical distancing to slow the spread of COVID-19. Instructions for attending or participating in the meeting were provided in the notice and include both internet and call-in options. The notice is available on the Energy Commission's website. Instead of a full day IEPR workshop, we've broken this topic into 3 sessions over 2 days to encourage participation. And so this morning's session is the second of 3 and addresses 3 revolutions, opportunities, challenges, and intelligent transportation systems. Session 3 is this afternoon at 2 p.m. The meeting is being recorded. We'll post a recording and written transcript on our website. Also, on our website, you can find today's presentations. We will be using the Q&A function in Zoom to pose some attendee questions to panelists during the automated and intelligent transportation panel discussion. Attendees may type questions for panelists by clicking the Q&A icon. And before typing a question, please check to see if someone else has already posed a similar question. And if so, you can click the thumbs up to vote on it. And the questions with the most thumbs up clicks are upvoted to the top of the list. So we'll reserve about 5 minutes at the end of the panel for attendee Q&A. And given the time restrictions and our full agenda, we won't be able to elevate all questions received. Also, given the packed schedule today, we do not plan to raise attendee Q&A to the 2 presenters before the panel. And now I'll go over how to provide comments on the material for today's workshop. There'll be an opportunity for public comments at the end of this and each of the 3 sessions. Please note that we will not have time for the panelists to answer questions during the public comment period. For those using Zoom online, click the raise hand icon to let us know you'd like to make a comment. And if you change your mind, you can click it again and your hand will go down. For those on the phone, just press *9 to press your hand, and then we will open your line during the public comment period. Alternatively, written comments after the workshop are welcome, and they're due on August 6th. And again, the notice gives you all the information for how to do that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Monahan for opening remarks. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm especially excited about the topics today. I am welcomed on the dais by Dan Sperling, who's the professor and founding director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. And for folks who weren't on yesterday's workshop, Dan is actually the person who coined the term the 3 revolutions. So it is particularly fitting that he's here joining me on the virtual dais today. And a number of folks from ITS Davis who have really been, I would say, the leaders in terms of evaluating the benefits and the potential drawbacks of the 3 revolutions. So we're really looking forward to having them illuminate us on what we can look forward to and what we're experiencing today in terms of the intersection of electrification, automation, and mobility as a service. So I want to see if Dan has a few opening remarks. I'm not sure, Heather, are there other members of the virtual dais? Are there other commissioners here yet?
Yes, Commissioner McAllister has also joined us.
Okay, great. All right, I'll turn it over to Commissioner McAllister after Dan has an opportunity to make some remarks. Dan, I think you're muted. If you're.
Oh, you want me to say?
Oh, yeah, I was hoping. I mean,
Okay.
You're the man when it comes to the 3 revolutions. So if you have nothing to say, that's not good.
I've got plenty to say. Okay, so to introduce this topic, there's these three revolutions. So the electrification in some ways is on track. Certainly the US is lagging, California is doing better than the US, but Europe is now ahead, China is ahead, but we're on track in some ways. The sharing part of it is really problematic, and I think that's perhaps the most important topic here today, because at the end of the day, sharing it is central to achieving a sustainable transportation system. Whether you're talking about transit or pooling of rides or shareable, dockable bikes and scooters, it's absolutely essential. Carpooling, it's absolutely essential to creating a sustainable transportation system. And the automation is the interesting kind of wild card. It's moving ahead. Some people are optimistic, some are pessimistic, but at the end of the day, it is going to happen eventually. And the challenge is to make sure we direct it, channel it toward the public interest. And it influences heavily the sharing part, especially, but also electrification. So I think we're going to hear a lot about this today. So this is a great topic. It's really, in my mind, these are central to creating sustainable transportation from an equity perspective, from an environmental perspective, and from an economic perspective.
Hey, Dan, I knew you would have something to say. That would be set the stage. I also want to emphasize that a lot of the advances in these three revolutions are occurring here in California. I mean, I think it's pretty fair to say that California is the epicenter when it comes to electrification, automation, mobility as a service. Lyft and Uber were founded here. Silicon Valley and LA are the home of lots of companies working on AI and integrating mobility as a service with autonomous vehicles, and even merging electrification as getting our three goals. That's where we get the heaven scenario when all three of these come together. So it's also, I think, a place for California to have leadership, both economically in this space and technologically as well. So it's the perfect topic for today for California and for the Energy Commission to delve into. So we really appreciate all the leadership of the many folks that are participating in this morning's workshop, including the folks at UC Davis, UC Berkeley, and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. I'm sorry, not UC Berkeley, and others. So I know that Commissioner McAllister is here as well. So there he is.
Hey.
Would you like to make a few remarks?
Yeah, just a couple. So I'm really looking forward to listening in on this. Honestly, this is a little bit of an extension of my kind of knowledge base. So I'm going to learn a lot today, and probably won't have a whole ton of comments, as many of you listening in and certainly presenters already are way beyond my knowledge on this particular slice of our energy landscape. But I did want to just sort of back up and point out, that the criticality of our electric system, I think, is becoming, more clear to everyone. It's always been important for our economy, but it really is that physical infrastructure that we've invested in over the last 100+ years is really taking on new importance in our modern economy. And it's, traditionally, historically, it's been a static resource, really unidirectional, a static resource, just pumping, power for a limited range of end uses, because we had all of this thermal energy over there doing other things. And it's now, really becoming the epicenter of most of our energy services, and will only be more that way over time. And this combination with mobility is just really kind of a mind bender for those of us who've been in, in the power sector for a long time. And having this static resource really be managed in real time, moment to moment, and providing mobility services. It really is it's really a brave new world out there with so much potential, so much upside. And we're the innovation economy in California. There's incredible innovation going on with power technologies, power management, the combination of power electronics and digital technologies is just opening up all of these doors, these huge doors of opportunity. So this is, I think, a great example of that. That's going to have really earth-changing consequences. So thanks, Dan, for your leadership on this, and really excited to hear what folks have to say today. So thanks for your leadership as well, Commissioner Monahan. So I will go on to fly on the wall mode and listen in for the rest of the morning.
And I want to add
Thank
just
you.
one little note. Patty Monahan, Commissioner Monahan, actually played a key role in launching this whole initiative. When in her previous position, she really played a big role in helping get us launched at UC Davis and statewide and nationally. So a lot of kudos to Commissioner Monahan as well.
Oh, thanks, Dan. I'm blushing. Well, we have a different format for this morning's workshop, where we're going to have two presenters and then a panel. So that's it's because there's so much interesting research kind of going to set the stage that we thought would be helpful for grounding the panel conversation. So I want to introduce the first speaker. It's Giovanni Circella, who's a Honda Distinguished Scholar for New Mobility Studies, and he's the director of the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program at UC Davis. His research interests include travel behavior, the adoption of emerging transportation technologies, and the impacts of ICT, shared mobility, micromobility. Giovanni is the chair of the TRB Committee on ICT and Travel Choices, and he's an elected member of the executive board of the International Association for Travel Behavior Research. So we really do have an expert to kick us off. Giovanni, can I ask you to turn on your mic and your video?
Hello, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak today here. It's a big pleasure, actually, to see so much interest about the three revolutions in transportation, and I hope my short presentation this morning will give an opportunity to think about a few topics that I think are worth a lot of attention in both research, but also in planning and policy making. If we can go to the next slide. So over the course of the last few years, transportation has really evolved a lot. We can remember it's almost 20 years since the first car sharing systems have appeared in the world, and then a lot of new evolutions with new mobility apps, smartphone apps today that can give access to a lot of services on demand. The latest thing that happened in our cities is micromobility with scooters zooming around everywhere. And then in the future, also more changes as automation will also give new opportunities to have a different relationship with traveling with various vehicles. Next. So really when we think about the future, and here is a quote I'd like to open, it's not really from somebody at UC Davis, not Dan Sperling or myself, but it's somebody that comes from the car manufacturing sector. And the Ford CEO really envisioned that people in the future won't have as many vehicles we have today because they'll share one and own only one. So somehow we're going into a period of transformation. The way we get there and how we will get there is the big question. Next slide, please. So as mentioned before, Dan Sperling really opened the way to thinking about the three revolutions. For those that have not read his book yet, I really encourage to read this book. But the question is really that these new technologies are transforming transportation very quickly, and it's very important to think about in which direction. So next slide, please. When we think about future mobility and the impact of the three revolutions, it's really like we could go in the direction of a heaven or hell. And these are two extremes. Probably the reality in the future will be somewhere in between. But if everything works well, and California is a good example, we could have vehicles that are predominantly electric, energy mix is clean, we can get better capacity for transportation, better livability in cities, and a lot of benefits. But things also could go very poorly. If we produce electricity with coal, if we have a lot more trips by car because automation making more convenient, if we have a reduced role of transit, there are a lot of risks. Where the future will go and how it will look like, it really depends a lot on the policies we shape today. And this we think is important also to think about this topic. Next. So at UC Davis, we launched this Three Revolution Future Mobility Program to really study the big changes in transportation supply and demand. And one of our goals is really to create a rigorous research in the university environment, cooperate with our partners, but also provide impartial policy analysis that can help make a good decision in the future. And we work with a number of partners, and of course, we would love to continue to work more with the California Energy Commission also to support your work. Next. Among the research questions that we think are very present to investigate are, what are the impacts, the new technologies, not only the three revolutions, but also e-shopping and everything that's happening, how this will affect the travel behaviors, but also vehicle ownership. Will we go in a period in which people will rely more on shared mobility rather than owning a private vehicle? But also in the short term, what replaces what? If people take a trip by scooter or calling an Uber, does this mean they leave the car at home in the garage, or that they are moving out of public transportation, or a mix of all of this? And we will talk about this in a few slides from now. Next. So if we look at the growth of shared mobility in particular in the last few years, at least before the pandemic, this has been really massive. If you look at the growth in the, for instance, the ride-hailing sector with the number of trips by Uber and Lyft, they really have built a ridership which is impressive. Still, this is mainly an urban phenomenon, which somehow creates even more problems in cities because like the pressure on traffic is actually very strong, exactly in the area where the road network is not made to accommodate a lot of car trips. Next. When we move into the other solutions, the big news in the last few years has really been the growth of shared mobility. Shared mobility has increased a lot. Bike sharing systems have been existing already for many years, but really since we started to see dockless bike sharing system and station-based bike sharing system, and dockless bike sharing, but also the e-scooter sharing, these have really boomed the number of trips made with these services. So in the next slide, we really wonder who is starting to use these services and what are the impacts. So to do this, next slide, we have been developing a number of projects. One of these, for instance, at UC Davis, we're managing a California panel study of emerging mobility patterns. So we're really studying people over time to see how their behaviors evolve over time. And we do this with a pretty large sample of individuals from all ages. Next slide. We're also launching other data collections all around the US and also with several partners working with partner institutions and universities in other parts of the world because it's really important to study this topic also in other contexts. Next. So for instance, to dive into some of these data, it's interesting to see how the prevalence of the use of these services is becoming so big. We see here, for instance, these are results from 8 cities in the United States, 8 major cities, so mainly urban population. But we see that the number of respondents in our study that reported that they are using the Uber and Lyft app on their phone is really becoming pretty large percentage of the users. Now, of course, this is for the urban population. Numbers are lower in rural areas. But it's also interesting to see how this is starting to become almost as important as things like, Airbnb or Amazon that have been already for many years in our life. And of course, the other services like car sharing, e-scooter sharing are still smaller and less common, but still, they are growing also them. Next slide. In a lot of our work, we're really focusing on who are the users, because we know the population has a lot of heterogeneity, maybe different segments of the population. And at the bottom of all these slides, I actually reporting some links to some journal papers and some reports where you can find more information about some of this work if you are interested in this area. But for instance, still today we see that a lot of the users of these services, the early adopters, are among some of the groups. This would be the group on the top parts of this slide, that are the better educated young millennials, young professionals that live in cities. It's also important to consider there are other groups using these services. The second one is actually a very interesting one. The second one that you see in this slide here, in the middle part of the slide, is actually more composed of people that are not the traditional early adopters of Uber, but they are people like, in established job, many times living with their family, sometimes in suburban areas, but they use, for instance, these services to go to the airport. So one thing that's interesting is that this group of users actually have a very different price sensitivity of the first group. So somehow when we think about policies also, we need to think also that the reaction to fares and prices or any policy that we make will be very different in different groups. Next slide. So in our work, we've been focusing also a lot about what are the impacts on the other use of the other modes of transportation. Next. And so, for instance, using data from California, we've been distinguishing that Uber and Lyft trips, of course, they have some impacts on the use of other modes, but they can be very different depending on who is making the trip and where the trip happens. As you see in this slide on the left side, we see that a large group of urban travelers many times substitute the use of transit, the use of walking and bicycling with the use of ride-hailing. So this is something actually that it's very important and we should consider in policy making. The climate standards we will talk in a few slides actually really focusing on this. On the second group in the middle, it's more like, one-to-one substitution, leaving the car in the garage and using Uber or Lyft. But the third group is an interesting one because these are people actually that they use transit more because of the availability of new shared mobility. Very interesting to study this because actually I would like to see this group growing more, and it would be in the societal interest to a better integration between public transportation and shared mobility. But also this is not always happening under market conditions. So the need for policy intervention is very important. Next slide. It's also very important when we look at the different services. So, for instance, the pool services, in orange in the slide, Uber Pool and Lyft Share, they have a very different impact than Uber on the use of other modes. But also when we look at who is making the trip, where the trip happens, for instance, we see that it's very different to consider a trip to and from the airport that is more likely to be in competition with taxi versus trips that are substituting for the use of public transportation. This happens many times for multimodal travelers in the urban core cities during the daytime. A lot of studies are also mentioning the induced demand that Uber and Lyft are creating, so additional trips that are happening. This tends to be more common for non-essential shopping trips, for leisure purposes, and also individuals that live in zero-vehicle households. So we should think also, in the policy perspective, what are the options that are available for these users and how we can try to align these services to the goals of sustainability and better interests of society. Next slide. I know many of you are interested in scooters. Well, scooters actually have an interesting pattern because in a lot of cases, they actually substitute for trips that would have been done by walking or with using a private bike or scooter. But also there is an interesting component because when we start looking at the distribution of trips, scooters are also eating somehow the shorter range of trips that would have been done by Uber and Lyft. So here there is a potential interesting mode shift from Uber and Lyft from ride-hailing to the scooters. And this is also under market perspective today, but in the future, if there is better integration with transit, this service can serve even more as an active egress mode for public transportation. And if you see on the right side, actually, of the slide, you can see actually that for longer trips by scooter, the competition with ride-hailing and with private vehicles actually increases. Next slide. So in the next steps of our research, we are really interested in studying longitudinal analysis, also to see how the adoption of shared mobility and new services are affecting vehicle ownership in the medium and long term. This is also a big question with mobility as a service. As we see the integration of multiple platform of services and multiple services in the same platform, which individuals will be likely to rely on these services instead of owning a car? Today it's only a minority, but it could change in the future as these services are provided in different ways. And so we're actually doing some new studies, actually studying, for instance, the access to the willingness to join mobility as a service systems, but also studying access to airports, and this is a cooperation with NREL and US DOE to really study, how new technologies are changing traveling to and from an airport. Next slide. One important consideration in California in particular is that there is a commitment for the government to create a clean mile standards. There are many other policies that can be developed. In this case, for instance, we're working with CARB to really inform with our research on ways in which we can increase pooling and occupancy in TNC vehicles, ways in which we can move towards more electrification of TNCs, decrease that heading, but also better connect with public transportation and potentially promote active transportation. We don't have a lot of results on this study yet, but we will have a lot by December because we're really doing a lot of work in the second part of this year to support CARB on these efforts. But in the next slide, we can see some of the data we're using for this study, in which we are using both the studies collected already in our data sets at UC Davis, but also we are accessing a lot of information created from SACO, by Sandag, other NPOs in California, and also other data sets that can be useful to support the clean mile standards policy making. And I suspect that a lot of the people that are in this meeting today could actually be interested in this process. So CARB is actually creating an advisory group for this project. If you are willing to serve in that advisory group, I will welcome experts from the California Energy Commission and other colleagues in the audience today to really join that group. Next slide. I also want to mention there is a big potential for electrification. This is connected to the climate standards, but also a lot of research already showing potential improvements in this area. My great colleague Alan Chen at UC Davis has been doing a lot of work in this area. It's really been showing that a lot of TNC drivers could be actually okay driving on electric vehicles. Next slide. If you look also at the charging patterns, it's very important to consider, though, to study the charging behavior of the CNC drivers and also the impacts on the charging infrastructure, because we can see, like, that, for instance, if you start looking at the charging behavior, the time of day, the frequency with which somebody charges, or even the amount of energy in each charging event, it's very different for the CNC drivers versus the other users. So an infrastructure that is designed for privately owned vehicles that are operated as personal vehicles can actually be not well suited for an infrastructure that needs to serve also TNC drivers. And also there are potential for large emission reduction benefits from TNC electrification. So we need really to study more in this topic. Next slide. Automation in the future will bring actually big impacts too. Our study, we've been working in collaboration with John Walker, Berkeley, and other colleagues, actually simulating some of the future. The bottom line of these studies is really showing that every data that we have today says that if automation happens in a privately owned fashion, with our cars becomes automated, there is a potential for a sharp increase in VMT. This is very important to consider because actually the policy here will really have a big role. If we don't want to get into the future, probably we need to promote more sharing, more fleet of shared automated vehicles in the future. Next slide. We're actually working a lot with the car, but also to model potential scenarios in the future with the potential ranges of VMT, greenhouse gas emissions, criterion pollutant emissions. There's certainly a lot of things to consider. So in the next slide, you can see, for instance, some of the main impacts that needs to be considered on VMT and greenhouse gas emissions where we consider automation. And certainly there are aspects of land use, travel demand, a lot of other issues that should be considered. Next slide. But we're already starting to create some policy-friendly documents that can actually support your work. So I invite you to check, for instance, this website link where we put some guidelines, for instance, to promote VMT reduction in greenhouse gas containment when automation will become actually part of our life. And I will invite more discussion on these topics because really key to the deployment of automation will be important to make sure that it's more done in a sustainable way. The last topic, the next slide, is really to think about what is happening right now. The world has changed very quickly in the last few months, and with COVID-19 pandemic, not only our lives are changing a lot with the needs for social distancing, impact on teleworking, e-shopping, and so on, but also the transportation supply and the world is changing. We're already seeing mergers and acquisitions. The last one, Uber decided to sell their Jump division and merge it with Lime. This is actually affecting the supply of new modes and the changes in the future. Next slide. We're actually developing a very big study, mobility study at UC Davis. Yesterday we had a webinar with many people in attendance, really discussing some of the early findings from the study. If you are interested, I really want to say that one of the key components is that we're building a longitudinal study studying these changes in a lot of different regions. Next slide. So for a combination of qualitative and quantitative research, but also resampling premium respondents, we will have data at different period of time. In the past, 2018 and 2019, for the people already participating in previous studies, right now in the data collection in 2020, but also we will continue to collect data in the future. Next slide. We already have collected more than 10,000 respondents that are participating in this big study. And we're really thinking about, what, conclusions we can already see and how this can support research and planning and policy efforts. I invite you to check our project website at the link that is listed there. Some early findings in the next slide, for instance, we can see a big reduction in physical travel for commuting. And also I want to mention that this is done in a very, very different way across different segments of the population. So some people, especially in the lower income categories, in some segments of the population, are forced to travel today. They cannot adopt e-shopping, telecommuting. But also there are changes that are happening because the pandemic is reducing the interest in shared mode of travel. This includes public transportation and ride-hailing. So a lot of things that are temporary today could really affect what happens in the future. Next slide. Really today we didn't have a lot of time, but I really want to call some of the considerations also if we move in the future. First of all is how much of the temporary will stick and translate into long-lasting terms. a lot of things actually probably will revert to the past. The history has shown that big disruption, when they go away, people go back to their old habits. However, as the disruption becomes longer, as is happening in this pandemic, there is a possibility that more permanent changes will stay. And also some things are here to stay, not only the changes in behavior, but also e-shopping will certainly continue. Retail space is changing. The economic activity will probably take a long time to recover. Next slide. We also need to think about how to promote shared modes in a way that is safe and healthy. I personally think micromobility is actually relatively a low-risk option compared to other modes, but still today it's penalized because a lot of cities really banned it during the pandemic, and also people are scared of using that. We need to think about funding issues also, because there is a big decline in the revenues for public transportation and a lot of the funding for state agencies. We need to think about policy that can really promote active modes and try to avoid a big increase in car travel in the future. And then big topics are about equity consideration. Really important to think about where the future is heading in the future, and also how we can make sure that those that are already disadvantaged today can actually get a chance to improve their conditions rather than further being penalized today also by the pandemic. Next slide. I invite you to check our website where we've posted a lot of material here, and so we will continue to post results from this research. And next slide is really my final thoughts, some policy considerations. I really think we are studying a world that's changing quickly, but it's very important to consider that in the future we should really put the human beings at the center of our attention and not think too much about cars. It's also important to see that a lot of things that we're studying today are really in the world the way it is in market conditions. But really pricing will be central to affecting policies, to affecting the way people do different activities and participation in use of different modes. It's very important to consider how to combine electrification with the other modes. We talk about shared mobility, the TNC electrification is a big example. But also let's not forget about the importance to make policies to push for behavioral changes, and also land use. That it needs to be coordinated with travel. It's very important. Today, too many times we consider land use as given. I know California has been leading already in trying to do coordination of land use and transportation, but we need probably to do more. Finally, in the future, with the mass, there is the possibility actually to change even more the relationship with private vehicle ownership. Private vehicle ownership in medium and long term can be affected when we have, instead of just one or two services, platform of service that integrate everything. And this could be actually a very good opportunity for the future. Next slide, I just have a link to our website where you can find a lot of the results from our variety of research projects. But also to close, I want to give a proper acknowledgement to a lot of the people that have been really contributing to our research. Next slide, please. We have a lot of great colleagues and experts that have been contributing in a lot of various areas, but also a lot of agencies that in California are working with us on many of the projects, and they're really supporting our work, and they are partners that work with us and really provide a lot of expertise. And this way we can also link our research to policy to try to really build a better world thanks to what we learn in our work. I will pause here. I'm sure there will be some questions, and I invite you to check our website for more details of any of our activities.
Giovanni, thank you. There was a lot of information there. And you talked really fast. So I may ask a question that was already on your slide and I just couldn't catch it. But I encourage the other members of the virtual dais, Commissioner McAllister and Dan Sperling, to join me on video. So I want to just follow up on what you, well, I guess I'm kind of integrating two themes, which is this health scenario and life post-COVID. So, the health scenario, right, is automation without electrification, without sharing. Mm-hmm. And that's where you just have a lot of increased VMT in internal combustion cars. I always think about this scenario of the family wanting to go to Disneyland when it opens and, getting their robo-car and having a sleeping mat in it and just having the car drive them to Disneyland and then go park far, far away, right? You don't have to pay expensive amounts of money for parking because you could just drive your robo-car to just go out into the sunset and come back and pick you up when you want to go home and then drive you all the way home. And that's the health scenario, right? Because you don't really care about traffic, you're just sitting there, maybe you're working or you're sleeping, and the vehicle's kind of set up for you to be super comfortable. And you could see in a COVID world where people are afraid to go onto public transit or share with anybody else, you could see that health scenario being more possible in this post-COVID world. And I wonder if you could just talk about it. Are you seeing any trends towards, like we're seeing in China, where people are buying more vehicles, or is it too early to say?
I would say it's probably too early to say. Some of the vehicle sales data have shown an uptick in vehicle sales. I think it was in May and June. There was an increase, but also there was following a sharp decrease in March and April. So it's really difficult to say what is just like, postponing of a purchase that was already planned. And anecdotally, there are some people actually that report seeing more in the dealers, zero vehicle households considering buying the first car. So somehow, sometimes a used car, if they cannot afford a new car. So there is that risk. Also, China, that is really being more getting rid of the pandemic faster than us. They have been showing car travel going up. This has been shown also in Europe, in many places. Car travel has recovered much faster than other modes. And so somehow it's at the pre-pandemic levels right now in many countries in Europe, while public transportation is actually way lower. And this is a big problem for a lot of European cities, because actually public transportation, both for urban trips and intercity trips, has a much bigger role. Here in the US, I think we're still in the middle of the pandemic. It's very difficult to say what the impact will be. I mean, first of all, right now we are locked down again at home and working remotely. Those that are lucky and can work remotely. Some other people, essential workers, that need to go to work, and many others have lost their job, unfortunately. But really, the future will depend, I think, on the combination of what happens during the pandemic, but also what we plan for the recovery. There's been already a lot of money that's been put in stimulus support. Europe has already been showing, linking this to some green solution, incentives to purchase a bicycle, incentives to purchase a personal bike. If people are concerned about sharing a scooter, why don't incentivize that they buy their own scooter? Many countries in Europe have actually been giving incentives not only for EVs, but also for electric scooters, personally owned e-bikes and bikes. And this has been successful in many places. Also, at the local and regional level, there's been incentives and policies to really promote active travel. For example, removing some parking space and converting more space to bike lanes that have been done in a kind of a tactical planning strategy, approaches, really in a short time, sometimes in a matter of a few days or few weeks, you see a bike lane appearing. And this is giving a signal, is promoting this. It's happening also in the US in some places. Actually, Oakland was a very interesting example. Some other places around the country have been showing some, at least on the temporary level, promotion of active travel. I think it's very important, and I know that here it depends also about what are the federal policies versus the state and regional, to really make a concerted effort to promote non-car solutions, because there is a big risk that the post-pandemic actually might be that people will go back to work because they will not telecommute forever. Maybe they will continue to telecommute to some extent, but it's likely that many people will go to commute physically most of their time. We will actually rely more on cars, and we might actually have negative effects. Also, I think that promoting electrification is very important. There is nothing that is creating an obstacle during the pandemic to electrification. Sharing is necessary, people are concerned about that, but why people should be concerned about electrification. So keeping pushing on electrification is very important. But I think also it's very important to think about, in the short term, about supporting non-car modes. In the medium term, to think about the shape of cities, medium and long term, especially as we see big changes happening. Retail is already suffering. A lot of shops are really going away, a lot of physical space for stores. So can we rethink our cities to have mixed uses or other type, residences mixed with the offices, more space converted to green areas, to active modes of travel, better sidewalk, better places where people feel comfortable and safe to do things. And this is really need to be thought more in the medium term. And then both in the short term and medium term and long term, pricing is very important. I think without very, very good strategies to promote what we think is in the societal interest, we will not achieve really good results.
Can you speak to the pace of automation? I think there was, a number of years ago, I think there was a fair amount of optimism that we could reach level 4 automation in the next several years. What's your sense of the pace of both technological development, but also acceptance of the technology?
Yeah, it's very difficult to say what an exact timeline would be in automation in the future. You are absolutely correct. There was a lot of optimism like a few years ago, showing that things were really immediate. By 2020, we would have seen fully automated vehicles on our roads and so on. And now we see even automakers are, many of them are pretty transparent, saying, okay, it will take longer. I think it's difficult to say when things actually will happen, at least as a mass adoption, not in just geofenced area, but as a really big impact on society. The most important thing is to get ready for the time, to try to make sure that we promote the shared rather than the privately owned automation type, to create also a system that will promote the integration with public transit, with walking and bicycling, to try to, we know what things can go wrong. Now it's in our ability to try to limit the damages. Whether it will happen in 5 years or in 10 or 15 years, it's a secondary problem to some extent. And probably the pandemic is also an unclear effect. Many companies actually cutting down expenses in research and development. Some others are actually saying that this can be an opportunity to push forward more with the automation transition.
So Giovanni, I want to make sure that Commissioner McAllister and Dan have a chance to ask questions, and we are actually running out of time. So I'm sorry, I didn't realize we were so close on time. So if you all have questions, and if I could encourage Giovanni to answer as quickly and shortly as pithily as possible, that would be great.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to, you almost answered the question I was going to ask, and I just wanted to emphasize something you said about the opportunity to rethink our urban landscape and sort of plug this integrally into the planning function, right? And it seems like the COGs, the councils of governments, and the regional planning organizations, and certainly the transportation planning, obviously, which you guys are all expert on, seem like really key actors in this. As there are all these questions circulating in the COVID era about commercial real estate and space and just the physical geography of our cities, it seems like a huge opportunity to kind of unpack that and figure out where we need to go in an integrated way. So I guess as you were talking, that was occurring to me, that boy, what a great opportunity as we are rethinking our daily patterns in a very fundamental way. That's going to have huge implications for real estate values in certain parts of the country and cities. So this just seems like a great way to optimize investment with that long-term kind of landscape in mind.
I totally agree. I would add also to do that as much as possible in a futuristic way, combining the land use and the planning aspect, also with opportunities given by technology. We know today that we can integrate technology in a good and a bad way. So thinking about the street, the public space, the land use, also with a word that today has the scooters, as the integration of platforms where we can have access in a fare system, also with public transportation, with car sharing, with a lot of other solutions, and really think about in that way to promote a culture of a more human-based, with more walkable trips, with better paths also to use non-car options, rather than too much we have left our cities grow as an enormous land of parking lots and adding more lanes for cars, which we know is not efficient. In a small scale might actually solve some problems, but in long term create more issue with congestion, traffic, and other problems.
Thanks. Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, so I'll just make 2 comments to make it quick and move so we can move on. One is that with automation, while there is a lot of skepticism, there is a lot of hype, the investment continues to pour in. And we just saw, for instance, Amazon just bought a California automation company, Zoox, and spent a lot of money on it. And Amazon's not going to do that unless they have some real intent. Now, of course, in that case, a lot of it's going to be for delivery of goods as opposed to passenger. At least that'll be probably their first application. But the investment's continuing, so I think it's going to happen. It'll be in a more limited way, but it's going to roll out. And one other quick observation is, from a policy perspective, transit is at the heart in the near term of what happens, because the transit industry was in big trouble. Now it's in desperate trouble. I mean, they're just going to disappear in many cases unless something revolutionary or transformational happens. And so probably the strategy forward is these shared mobility companies working more closely with transit, let transit be more efficient and let the shared mobility companies provide services and serve low-income people in particular. Now, to do that sounds simple, but there's a lot of financial revolutions and other changes that have to take place. But both industries are moving in that direction. So that is, and so the role of policy is to encourage those.
Great.
I
Thanks,
agree with
everybody.
everything
And
that is
Dr.
said.
Chuchella, thank you so much. I'm sorry, we have to move to our next speaker. I want to make sure that Zach has a chance to. But this has been a great discussion, and I think one of the heartening things is that Zoox is actually an electric autonomous company, so that's a good sign for Amazon's investment. So let's move on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining. That was really helpful and really informative presentation. So we're moving on to Dr. Zach Needle. He is an energy and environmental policy project engineer at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, which is one of my previous jobs. Not that specific one that Dr. Needle has, but I worked there as well. He holds a PhD in transportation from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So we welcome you to give us more information about the free revolution.
Thanks. And good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thanks, Giovanni, for that excellent framing for this talk. So today I'm going to be talking about integrated modeling of three revolutions. And I'm going to do it through the lens of the BEAM model, which we've developed at Berkeley Lab, but I'm going to do it in as general interest and in as general of a way as possible. So next slide, please. So I'm going to start by talking about what aspects of a transportation system we're modeling and why I think this kind of modeling can add value. I'll then give some background on how to model transportation systems, both in general and in particular with BEAM, and give a little more detail about how we model free revolution type behavior specifically within BEAM. And then the results section of this presentation is going to be framed kind of at a high level as to what types of questions do I think this sort of detailed modeling is best equipped to answer. Next slide. So yeah, getting into details about modeling transportation systems. Next slide, please. As kind of context and motivation, big technology changes like electrification and automation are going to lead to fundamental transformations of how a transportation system works. And at the same time, the behavioral response to these technology changes is going to be just as important. And so kind of better understanding how this behavioral and technology change can interact with each other is really important to understanding how the transportation system will evolve. And to make things more complicated, the changes we're talking about will occur on vastly different timescales. So for automation, for instance, automated vehicle technology will affect how individual vehicles interact with each other while merging onto the highway on one hand at the second by second level, but it will also impact, at least indirectly, land use and development patterns that evolve over decades. And so kind of pulling both of these two vastly different effects into the same conceptual framework and the same model is really interesting, but also really hard. So why do we bother doing it? We still need to make decisions, both in the short and medium term, even if there is this great deal of uncertainty about where the transportation system will go. And I think that modeling can add value to that as long as we're honest about what we can and can't promise with the modeling. I think detailed modeling is especially important for systems where we don't have empirical observed data to rely on. So we can't go and observe, a fully automated electric ride-hail fleet operating in a different country and extrapolate its results to here because they just don't exist. And so often the next best thing we can do is build a mechanistic model of how these fleets would function from the ground up and learn what we can from it. And I think that gets at what I think is one of the main values of this level of detailed modeling is that it kind of keeps you honest. So, if you're expecting some certain, possible evolution of the future, you should at least be able to build a ground up model that leads to that kind of behavior. And by building this model, you can really look under the hood and better understand how a potential transportation future works and what the main levers are, what the main interactions are, and what the main constraints are that would lead us to or away from that future. So next slide. So yeah, how do we model a transportation system? We can think of a transportation system as having a supply side and a demand side. So on the supply side, we have travel speeds on links of the road network, occupancy of the transportation system, parking availability. And there are a lot of models out there that really focus in detail on modeling supply side, and they can be really valuable for certain tasks like modeling the effects of signal timings or lane configuration. There are also a lot of models that focus on the demand side in particular of the transportation system. So how many trips people take, where do they go, what mode do they use? And there's a lot of interesting modeling on this side, or analysis on this side too, that kind of treats the supply side of the transportation system in a kind of fixed or simplified way. Next slide. There are certain kinds of questions, though, that really rely on linking the supply side and demand side and considering them both integrated at the same time. So a kind of classic example here is induced demand. So for instance, if you widen a congested highway, all of a sudden there's more capacity, speeds can go up, but then more people, the car mode becomes more appealing, more people drive their cars, you have more cars on the highway, and then you get back to congested conditions. And so that kind of linkage of supply and demand requires a new set of models. And for a long time, the kind of state-of-the-art way of doing this was with a four-step model, which starts by taking a city or metro area, dividing it into transportation analysis zones, and then modeling travel behavior as flows between these zones. So yeah, this has been kind of state-of-the-art for a long time, is still widely used by metropolitan planning organizations, is really valuable for a lot of planning tasks. Next slide, please. But modelers are always trying to make things more complicated. So for the past 10, 20 years, the kind of state-of-the-art of this field has been with ABMs. And the term ABM can be sometimes confusing because sometimes the A refers to agent-based model, sometimes it refers to activity-based model. I think, fortunately, though, most of the models people are talking about when they're talking about the transportation ABM are both. So what I mean by an agent-based model is that it's made up of a discrete set of agents that operate with their own set of rules and can interact with each other. And in the transportation context, these are often individual travelers. So you can simulate a city with millions, multiple millions of people as they move around. And as you expect, this can be computationally hard and require a lot of computational resources in order to solve. In terms of an activity-based model, that really refers to how the simulated agents structure their travel behavior. So instead of thinking of travel behavior as just a set of trips, we model how travelers structure their daily plans around a sequence of activities in different places that they choose to participate in. And what this lets you do is capture whole day correlations and constraints that you can't, or at least are very hard to model in simpler models like four-step models. So for instance, in the real world, you rarely see people walk to work in the morning and then drive their car home because there wouldn't be some way of getting your car to work during the day. Or for instance, if congestion is really bad during the evening commute, people may shift some of their shopping trips from the evening commute to some other time in the day. And this kind of integrated whole day framework of the activity-based model lets you to capture these constraints and correlations. Next slide. So BEAM is one of these agent-based activity-based models. And so I'll give a quick slide about our philosophies for why we made a new model rather than relying on other ones that are out there. And I just want to start with the disclaimer that we're not trying to replace MPO models with BEAM. The idea is to develop a model that is designed to be applicable to long-term scenarios where there are fundamental changes to the transportation system rather than, smaller perturbations. And so our kind of hypothesis is that by focusing less on, predicting the precise speed on a precise link of the system at a certain time, and instead by really starting from scratch and modeling mechanistically the way in which the resource markets that make up a transportation system function, this model will be more applicable to futures where everything changes. So, people might structure their decision-making processes differently in 20 or 30 years, but as long as we get the way that road capacity or, vehicle sharing services operate well, we'll at least have a good, the underlying structure of the way the transportation system evolves, we'll be able to capture well. And I'll get into some of the details of how we influence some of the resource markets more in a couple slides. So next slide. And also, as I had mentioned before, the aspect of different timescales is really important in this kind of modeling. So, we can think of some aspects of the transportation system that evolve over multi-year timescales. So land use, makeup of the vehicle fleet, for instance. Some aspects vary day to day and hour by hour. So mode choice of individual travelers, operations of shared mobility fleets, for instance. And then some things really vary second by second. So, the energy use of an individual vehicle as it accelerates to merge on the highway, for instance. Next slide. So yeah, BEAM, we focus on this day-to-day behavior, but BEAM exists as part of the Smart Mobility Workflow, which is a collection of separate models developed mostly in the National Lab space, funded by the Department of Energy. And all these models are designed to integrate well with each other, talk to each other. So basically, when we run BEAM, we can communicate directly with a model of land use evolution, or with advanced models of individual vehicle energy consumption to better understand the way both of these different timescales affect what we're seeing in BEAM and vice versa. Next slide. For this within-day system that we're modeling in BEAM, basically what we're doing is we're generating a synthetic population of agents and running them through a day of travel, including mode choices, all sorts of modes, transit, car, walk, bike. And basically at the end of a simulated day, we have these agents evaluate their score, how they did that day, and then potentially replan for the next iteration in order to improve how they score. And by iterating through this multiple times, we ended up at a user equilibrium where everyone is doing basically the best they can. Next slide. So to give a little more detail about how we model three revolutions in BEAM, next slide. So for sharing, one of the ways we model sharing is that we spend a lot of effort modeling the ride-hail fleet, which involves modeling kind of in real time the dynamic allocation of individual vehicles to individual customers and the pooling of individual customers into pooled trips. And what this allows us to do is provide the simulated agents with real-time price and wait time quotes for trips. So, this captures the feedback where, for instance, if there's an undersupply of vehicles in the market, wait times go up, and then, people are seeing longer wait times for their trips, and fewer people are willing to take shared modes. So next slide, please. One of the ways in which we capture the impact of automation is by modeling household automated vehicles in detail. So here we assume that households coordinate to deploy all of their automated vehicles in order to best serve as many trips as possible of the household. And so what this means in terms of impact on the transportation system is more household vehicle automation leads to more vehicle miles traveled in two ways. It means that individuals are more likely to take longer trips and take more trips when they have access to an automated vehicle, because we're assuming that this time an electric vehicle is or automated vehicle, excuse me, is more enjoyable. But also because these vehicles are serving multiple people's needs, there is more shuttling between locations as these vehicles try to serve multiple people's needs. Next slide, please. And then finally, in terms of electrification, this agent-based framework lets us model the individual state of charge of individual vehicles in detail over the course of the day, which allows us to model charging decisions in detail. And in BEAM, we do this distinctly for personal electric vehicles, for human-driven ride-hail vehicles, and then for automated ride-hail vehicles that we're all simulating. Next slide, please. In terms of results, I want to frame this kind of result section in terms of what, at a high level, are the directions and types of questions that, you know, a model like Beam, a detailed integrated travel demand model, is best equipped to answer. And so, yeah, I want to frame this by saying that a lot of these results are still working their way through the peer review process. So I direct you to, you know, adjust your main takeaways to be more along the lines of the big picture question and the big picture direction. So next slide, please. So one question that I think is particularly important is what are the important interactions and constraints associated with new mobility paradigms? Next slide, please. So here we ran some big scenarios of long-term future evolutions of the transportation system. We did a high sharing, high automation case, so the heaven scenario that Giovanni was talking about, and a low sharing, high automation case, the hell scenario. To make things more complicated, we modeled high technology and low technology versions of these slides, of these future scenarios. And on the left, we were showing the energy consumption of these different scenarios. And a big takeaway was that the hell scenario, the low sharing scenario, didn't really do any better than the heaven scenario. And so we kind of looked in more detail at that, and we looked at the performance of, and we found that a lot of this extra vehicle miles traveled was coming from the ride-hail fleet driving around empty. And so we looked in more detail at why this was coming from, and basically it came from the fact that we had calibrated our we had calibrated our repositioning model, so our model of where these ride-hail vehicles go when they're idle and don't have passengers in them, to match observed behavior right now. And when we extended this out in the future, it led to a very large number of empty miles. And so, you know, we played around with tweaking parameters to see the effect on the system. And we found that, yeah, we could reduce this amount of empty vehicle miles traveled by reducing the sensitivity of repositioning. But what this meant is that all of a sudden the vehicles weren't in the right place. And so wait times went up a lot for ride-hail trips. And so, okay, we can adjust for this by increasing the size of the ride-hail fleet, meaning that there are more vehicles to go around to people. But where this ends up is that you have a lot of vehicles sitting around empty for most of the day, not making money for whoever owns the vehicles. And so my main takeaway here is not necessarily that it's impossible to imagine a very efficient, high sharing, high automation future, but just that we shouldn't assume that it's going to happen automatically. That, you know, even in a situation where people are very willing to take shared rides, you know, a profit-driven provider of these ride-hail services won't necessarily end up providing a service that is very energy efficient. Next slide, please. Another question that I think this kind of modeling is well equipped to answer is, what are the order of magnitude sized effects of competing processes? So next slide. So here's an example of work that's ongoing now. That's the long-term goal is to measure the impact of fast charging on the electric grid distribution network. And so we started out, though, by looking at the impacts of electric vehicle charging on the bulk power system. We ran two scenarios with different levels of reliance on a shared automated electrified ride-hail fleet. So the plot on the left shows a scenario where a lot of people have given up their household vehicles and rely on this fleet. And the scenario on the right shows a scenario where a much smaller percentage of people have given up their vehicles. And what we can see is that in neither case, the bulk of the bulk power system demand is still driven by slow charging from household automated vehicles. Which is not to say that, you know, this blue area on top coming from DC fast charging is not going to be really important, especially at the distribution level. But, you know, this kind of modeling allows us to put some kind of bounds and be able to compare at the high level, you know, how the impact of this fast charging from the ride-hail fleet compares to slow charging from the personal vehicle fleet. Next slide, please. So my final kind of case study is a question of what can the distributional effects of large-scale change to the transportation system look like. what we did here is we looked in detail at the impact of household vehicle automation on the transportation system. So we varied the penetration of household automated vehicles from 0% to 2/3, which is the x-axis on these plots. And we can see that on the left plot, if we look at total vehicle miles traveled in the system, the more automated the household vehicle fleet is, the more vehicle miles traveled you have, as expected. And this increase in VMT is driven largely by empty movements of these household vehicles as they shuttle from place to place. However, if we look at the impact on individual mobility, we see that actually as you increase household vehicle automation, you decrease the amount of person miles traveled, so how much people are moving around, which is kind of a counterintuitive result because we expected people to be more willing to travel long distance than cabs. And so looking more into that, we looked at the differences between households that did and did not have access to a CAV. And we found that as you increase CAVs, you increase congestion on the road network. And therefore, if you have access to one, you don't really care about spending another 10 minutes in your automated vehicle. But if you don't, travel becomes much more burdensome. So the negative effects of this congestion are falling almost entirely on households without automated vehicles, and that's where these decreases in mobility are coming from, which leads to kind of an interesting tragedy of the commons solution, where if you can afford one, it always makes sense to buy a CAV, buy an automated vehicle. But the negative societal impacts of that are borne mostly by the households who don't buy one. So next slide. Thanks. And so yeah, that's my presentation. I just want to say that this code, this is all open source. We welcome new users, new collaborators, and feel free to reach out on email. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Dr. Needle. That was really interesting and some counterintuitive. I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit on this equity question. I mean, that's really important for us in California as we think through what are the right policies to make sure that we create a system that's equitable, or at least try to create a system that's equitable, foster that in all of our investments and strategies. Does your modeling provide any insight into the policies that we would need to make sure that we are creating an equitable transportation system? I mean, this idea that rich people will buy cabs and that's going to then create more of a burden for people who don't have cabs and can't afford them. What does that mean in terms of policy for California?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting and really important question. And I don't necessarily want to overpromise what this kind of modeling can do on its own. So, with a model like Beam, because we're representing individual agents, it's easy to just like divide agents into categories and look at, aggregate effects on different categories of agents. But when we're talking about, policy responses, it all of a sudden becomes, I think, really nuanced because you have a feedback effect in terms of, what groups of people respond to the policies in which ways. And so there's kind of this sort of endogeneity problem. So I guess my takeaway from that is I think modeling like Beam can be really useful as part of an integrated way of thinking about the impacts of policies, but it's not a solution on its own. And I think it needs to come with a lot of, further thinking and research into the behavioral responses to those policies at kind of short timescales and in terms of longer term timescale decisions like, okay, does this household buy a cab? Or, which households in particular are going to be more likely to buy one?
Commissioner, you're muted.
Hey, sorry about that. We're going to try to get back on time track, but if Commissioner McAllister or Dan has a burning question, you're welcome to ask it of Zach. We'd like to turn over to the next panel at 10:40, which is 2 minutes away.
No, I'm good. I really like the presentation, and I really agree with the equity concerns. I mean, just today, I think there was an article in the New York Times, I believe, about how home ownership is driving, the desire for home ownership is driving movements, and, with kind of an ethnic kind of overlay. The article was about just different, different folks moving in different places, and access to transportation is going to just be a really important overlay there. So Commissioner Monahan's question about like the equity implications, I think there's a lot of unknowns there. So I agree that modeling can help us if we could, be integral about how we talk about demographics within that, how we include demographics in that, so we make sure to see those trends and appreciate them along the way. That's going to be important.
Yeah, and I would note that one of the key premises of that health scenario was exactly what Zach laid out in terms of the equity impacts. So we've been aware of that's a likely implication for a while. But I do have one question. It's a hard question, so Zach will probably I think it's probably just better to give a short answer, and then we can others can pursue it. And that is, this agent-based modeling is great stuff, and it's very important research. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to really get at is, when do people buy cars, and when are people willing to share? And the question is, what are the set of rules that are being developed to explain how people make those choices? And it has to go beyond cost and time and to what are called the hedonic costs, or the non-monetary costs. And I'd be interested just in a short take on response, because we need to figure this out. It's like what I said at the beginning. How do we get people to share? So we need to understand, how do we get people to give up cars, and how do we get people to share? And we need to understand it before we can adopt policy. Any quick thoughts, Zach?
Oh yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that I think that's crucial. In a lot of this work, we were kind of treating, a lot of those questions as, exogenous scenario inputs, which I agree is like not fully satisfying, because those are the things we're trying to influence. And so, yeah, I mean, that is in our long-term plan for where we want this model to go, to be able to better integrate the kind of day-to-day decisions we're talking about with longer-term decisions of, like, am I a person who takes ride hail or not? Am I a person who likes shared mobility or not? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that, this, any kind of detailed modeling work that happens needs to come from a place of, deference to, the fact that it is really difficult to capture all of these factors within the modeling framework itself.
Keep at it.
Great, thanks, Zach. Really appreciate the insights you've given us. And now it's time to move to our panel discussion. Heather, do you want to kick this off for us?
Sure, thanks, Commissioner. I'd also just, before we get into it, I just wanted to let folks know that we have a couple of presentations that are still working their way to getting posted on the web. So you can look for that and just know we're working on it. So thanks, everybody. And now we will move on to our panel discussion on automated and intelligent transportation systems. And it is moderated by Ben D'Alba from the Energy Commission, who is a policy advisor to Commissioner Monahan. So go ahead, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Heather. Good morning, everybody. As Heather said, my name is Ben D'Alva. I'm an advisor to Commissioner Monahan. I'm very excited to moderate today's panel discussion on automated and intelligent transportation, one of the components of the three revolutions. We have an esteemed panel representing a diverse set of perspectives on this topic. Each panelist will have 8 minutes to provide an opening presentation, and then I will invite Commissioner Monahan and others on the virtual dais to ask any questions they may have of the panel before we transition to a moderated discussion. Before we get started, though, I wanted to add some context to today's conversation. There is no question that autonomous vehicle technology has arrived in California, The California Department of Motor Vehicles established California's first autonomous vehicle testing program in 2014. Today, just 6 years later, there are over 70 entities that hold a permit to test autonomous vehicle technology on California roads. And some sectors have already adopted automation. Terminal operators at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach are utilizing driverless vehicles to move cargo containers on and off ocean vessels. Major auto manufacturers now offer semi-autonomous systems in their passenger vehicles, such as Tesla's Autopilot and Cadillac's Super Cruise. And platooning technology, a stepping stone to automation, has had some success in the trucking industry. Automated and intelligent transportation systems will have a profound impact on how we move both goods and people. What we don't know is how automation will impact other aspects of the transportation system. Will the technology improve equitable access to mobility or be a luxury for those who can afford it? Will autonomous vehicles contribute to congestion or reduce it? And can we expect this technology to enhance the interaction between zero-emission vehicles and the grid? There are many questions that remain unanswered, as we heard earlier this morning. So if California is to avoid a negative response to those questions, then we need to listen to all impacted by the technology, including those on our panel today, to develop a sensible policy framework for autonomous vehicles. With that, I want to welcome our first speaker, Hannah Krieger. She is the Environmental Equity Program Manager at Greenlining Institute. She works on the deployment and implementation of policies leading to clean transportation and mobility investments that will benefit low-income communities of color. She was the lead author of Autonomous Vehicle Heaven or Hell, creating a transportation revolution that benefits all. A report outlining policy recommendations to ensure mobility, health, and economic benefits to marginalized communities. Welcome, Hannah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. For those of you who are not familiar, Greenlining is a research and public policy nonprofit, and we've been advocating for racial equity for 27 years. Now, I always like to begin with just a brief summary of our country's explicitly racist public policies so that we can better understand the equity impacts in the AV and mobility space. And then I'll discuss how to center equity in the planning, decision-making, and development and deployment of AVs. Next slide, please. So redlining was one of many racist policies and was the institutionalized and systematic practice of government working with realtors and banks to draw these red lines around communities of color, segregate them into undesirable areas, and deny them loans to buy homes or open businesses, out of the racist perception that it was too risky to lend money to people of color. And so for decades, while white Americans were amassing intergenerational wealth to buy homes, start businesses, and fund their children's education, people of color were effectively locked out of those same opportunities. Next slide, please. And the result is a racial wealth gap that looks like this today. For every dollar that a white family has, an Asian family has 68 cents. A Latino family has 10 cents. And a Black family only has 8 cents. And unfortunately, these numbers are outdated. The wealth gap is only getting wider. And so we have to keep this in mind as AVs and new mobility technology rolls out. We have to be super conscious about the very real job loss impacts of AVs and how this would exacerbate the widening racial wealth gap. Next slide. And today, low-income folks and people of color suffer from higher rates of pedestrian fatalities, largely because their communities are less likely to have safe sidewalks and lighting. And so it's important to think about AVs and safety in this context. We have to be tracking AV collisions based on location because they're much more likely to occur in low-income communities of color where there's less safe infrastructure. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to share that context because that is the context that AVs have hit our streets, where the playing field just clearly is not level. And if we're not careful, just like Uber and Lyft, AVs may actually exacerbate existing disparities if we allow them to perpetuate automobile dependency and compete with transit, if we don't ensure that all people have equal access, and if we fail to safeguard people with driving jobs from companies who would put profits above people. And so instead of just revolutionizing vehicles, the real opportunity here is to revolutionize the transportation system that they're operating in. Because I'll admit, there are some incredibly exciting equity opportunities around AVs, such as the potential improved mobility, the reduction in vehicle collisions, and lower transportation costs. And all of this would particularly benefit marginalized people. But to get there, we first need to center equity and community engagement in how we research and plan for any new mobility technology. Next slide. And just to be clear, I mean, equity goes way beyond just access. Equity is really about transforming the behaviors, the institutions, and the systems that disproportionately harm oppressed groups of people. Equity is also about increasing access to power. It's about redistributing resources, eliminating barriers to opportunity, and empowering marginalized communities to thrive and reach their full potential. And in the context of transportation, equity means really reimagining the way we've been doing transportation planning and decision making, which largely has been centered around white supremacy, racism, and capitalism. Low-income folks of color have systemically been shut out of the transportation planning and decision-making process, while the private sector and wealthy, white, able-bodied people often do have that direct access, both as decision makers themselves and in the public engagement process. And so we can't expect that by simply introducing a new transportation technology will somehow create, equitable outcomes when marginalized people continue to be barred from participating in shaping what that world even looks like. Next slide. And so now I want to share Greenlining's solution to this, which is our mobility equity framework, a tool that determines which mobility options most equitably meet the needs of a community. And this framework has been adapted in San Francisco and the Seattle region. So there's 3 steps. First, conducting a community mobility needs assessment. Second, running an equity analysis to compare the various mobility options. And third, placing that final decision-making power in the hands of the community to determine which mobility options to deploy. And so this process is how we should be making plans and decisions around AVs and all other mobility options. Because equity is not about first developing a technology without any community input, and then going back, trying to mold it into something that might meet a community's needs. I mean, equity is about marginalized communities having the appropriate or deciding on the appropriate solutions that meet their mobility needs. Because in reality, they are the experts in their community, not the mobility companies, not researchers, and not their government. And so, through a process like this framework, maybe the community said all they really needed was safe sidewalks or better bus service. Or maybe the community is indeed interested in AVs. And in that case, this tool can help determine if that should come in the form of AV microtransit or ride hailing. However, even if a community does select AVs as their desired mobility option, that's still not enough. We still need equitable guidelines and accountability for how that AV service is developed and deployed. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. And good news, we developed a tool for that. So this is our 4-step roadmap for turning equity commitments into an equity practice. So within any mobility pilot, policy, or funding stream, equity must be embedded throughout the goals, vision, and values, the process by which it's developed, the outcomes, and the measurement and analysis. Now, there's very detailed substeps within each, and the complete toolkit is on our website under the same name. Next slide. The last resource I'll mention is Greenlining's report on equitable policy recommendations for AVs, and it covers every topic from transportation to climate to jobs, and it's all on our website. Next slide. But what I really hope that I conveyed today is that, trying to retroactively mold AVs to be more equitable should not be the guiding force in these conversations. Because even if we do develop the most equitable, the most accessible AV service, at the end of the day, we'll still have unsafe streets, a broken car-dependent transportation system that's reinforced by inequitable planning, policy, and decision-making structures. And so we can't keep trying to just fix all of our transportation issues with more and more technology. And instead, we have to proactively build equity in throughout our transportation system as a whole, not just through any one piece of technology. And we have to do this by first fostering transportation planning and decision-making processes that are centered around the needs and voices of our most marginalized populations, and then pinpointing the appropriate mobility solutions. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Nadia Anderson. Nadia is a member of Cruise's government affairs team, where she focuses on legislative, regulatory, and policy priorities in San Francisco and California. Prior to joining Cruise, she led Uber's global public policy work on road and traffic safety, and has spent the majority of her career working on policy issues related to technology, mobility, and equity. Nadia holds a doctorate in urban affairs and public policy from the University of Delaware. Welcome, Nadia. Nadia, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I think we're good now.
You're good. All right, take it away.
Great. Sorry about that. Thank you, Ben. Also, I was saying thank you to the Commissioner Monahan, McAllister, and Dr. Sperling for the opportunity to be here today. As the slide says, my name is Nadia Anderson, and I'm here today to share Cruise's approach to shared, automated, and electric transportation. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Cruise. We are a relatively new entrant to the transportation space. We were founded in 2013, and we're working to safely introduce a fully electric self-driving car service into the transportation mix. From our view, we are uniquely suited to contribute to this conversation because we are the embodiment of the three revolutions. We are fully electric. We've been this way since the beginning and have no plans of shifting course. We're automated. We're working to solve one of the toughest challenges out there when it comes to transportation, which is self-driving technology. And the last piece is that we are shared. We have a future vision for efficient travel and encouraging more passenger mile travel and providing people and things with viable options for getting around. Next slide, please. And what I just shared is our reason for being here today and our ongoing engagement with a number of stakeholders who are also working within this space. We have an innovative business model, one that aligns with statewide goals for transportation electrification and overlaps with a number of areas where the Energy Commission is also working and committing resources. Now, what's different and worth noting about us is that our model and our presence at scale is that first, we intend to directly provide the public with an option for travel via green miles that is not personal car ownership and more aligned with the traditional sense of ride sharing. The second is the fact that we're fully electric. And for us, this means building, owning, and operating the electric vehicle stations that are going to be needed to support our vehicles. Next slide. Now, the Commission and many others are actively working on programs related to the transportation fuel sector, specifically targeting their shared potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promoting economic development. Now at Cruise, we believe meeting these goals means being intentional and thinking outside of the box when it comes to policies and programs. And the two things on this slide not only reflect our approach, but our thoughts on how we can continue to move along the path towards meeting statewide goals, specifically as it relates to transportation and electrification. The first piece is supporting electrification by getting more EVs out on the road. Now, we're continuing to see that consumer education and exposure are key for increasing adoption and in overcoming some of the traditional barriers. There's a growing body of research that supports this, and that people are more interested and in state an increased likelihood that they'll purchase an EV once they've been exposed to one. The second is adjusting how we think about travel to include the promotion of EV miles. We know that everybody's situation is not the same and that people have unique travel needs. So when we talk about zero emissions in the transportation sector, we need to also consider the ways to make EV travel more widely available, regardless of whether you're able to purchase an EV, install or readily access an EV charging station at your home or at your place of work. And when we talk about travel, we also immediately go to vehicle miles traveled. However, we should also consider in ways what's lesser known in some circles, which is passenger miles traveled or PMT, and what a shift in focus can mean for our statewide goals. We should expand this conversation to include what an increase in greener miles traveled can do for travel and mobility, and also recognizing that there are models out there, including ours, that are incentivized to not only be efficient in our operations, meaning reducing empty VMT, while also increasing PMT. Now, along these lines, innovative models that align with the three revolutions also have the potential to address what I'm going to call the back end of transportation electrification, something that is also of interest to the Commission and other organizations, which is grid integration, energy storage, and demand charge management. Now, at Cruise, we own and operate a fleet which opens up a world of possibilities when it comes to how and when we interact with the grid. For example, we currently participate in CARB's Low Carbon Fuel Standard program and are powering our cars on 100% renewable energy. This is something that we are able to do not only because of how the program was designed, but also based on our business model, the fact that we own and operate our own stations. In the future, this interaction could reflect the goals of and support many programs and initiatives being run by other organizations like CARB and the CAISO regarding transportation emission reduction in alignment with the needs of the electrical grid at large. So there's tons of opportunity here. And if we're able to continue to expand our thinking and change the way that we can leverage the benefits of all these supportive models can have, not only on our electrification goals, but also on our energy and environmental goals as well. Next slide, please. Now I want to close with Cruise's future vision by sharing a proof point of our commitment to not only operating differently within this space, but also our alignment with the 3 revolutions. And this slide is an image of the Cruise origin. It was announced in late 2019 and is also a fully electric, purpose-built vehicle designed specifically for a new type of travel experience. One of the goals with the Origin was to help shift how people think about transportation and to provide a new experience for people looking to move around our communities and our cities. For us, this is more than a prototype, meaning that the vehicle is production ready. And while it's not on the road today, we are ready to pull the trigger when the time is right. Now, in closing, I'd be remiss if I also didn't acknowledge that moving towards the 3 revolutions means taking a number of things into consideration, and the fact that autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles alone are not a silver bullet for all of the challenges that we're facing in our transportation system. We need to make sure we keep the person in the loop and recognize that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to mobility. We also need to make sure that people are able to use the options that meet their specific needs and doing many of the things that Hannah mentioned regarding equity and making sure that people and communities are at the table when these decisions are being made. All of these things we need to do by making sure that we are building and thinking of ways to avoid those missteps of the past that were also mentioned in the previous presentation. Now at Cruise, we believe that we can get there by designing and implementing policies and programs that are flexible, introspective, and able to adapt to new and emerging models that were not around when these programs were first promulgated. All of these things are top of mind for us as a company. We plan to do our part and again, believe that we have a unique role to play in helping the state meet its goals and doing something that's truly new and innovative when it comes to the transportation sector at large. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks and thank you all again for the opportunity to be here today. And I also look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Nadia. Our next panelist is Mike Rhodes. Mike has worked in the commercial vehicle industry for over 35 years. He is the executive director of the North American Council for Freight Efficiency and is the trucking lead for the Rocky Mountain Institute. His recent work has included guidance on electric and hydrogen electric trucks and opportunities along the evolution of automation and connectivity. Mike earned a master's degree in organizational leadership from Indiana Institute of Technology. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Hello, everybody, and Ben, thank you. It's an honor to be with you today, and we're going to move from, cars and some of the personal mobility up to big trucks. And so we at NACFE, we're the North American Council for Freight Efficiency, as Ben mentioned, and you can go forward, Ben. And we work in this space as truly an unbiased nonprofit. So we're helping the industry to use less fuel, move to more sustainable energy as we increase the sustainability of moving goods around the country and really across all of North America. If you're interested in some of the work, everything on our website is free with no membership. So have a look if you'd like. Today, go ahead, next slide. Today, I've been asked to look at platooning and how automation is affecting movement of goods by tractor trailers. And I like to start with the fact that these trucks are bought and utilized as tools. They're meant to help move goods and do it as cost effective and with, of course, safety and logistics and timing to get the job done and get all the goods that we want and need to the places where we can use them, whether it's to our homes or offices, et cetera. An interesting thing to look at is the cost per mile for these big trucks. And so here we look back at when fuel was pretty expensive and it was up to 65 cents a mile across the country to run one of these tractor trailers. And at that point, the cost of fuel was higher than the cost of the driver. That's the labor and the benefits for that driver. And just easy math, most of these trucks operated about 100,000 miles a year. Either within a state or across state lines. And so these dollars add up significantly. Fuel prices are lower today, and driver costs are up a little bit there as you look at 2018. But the driver and the fuel make up 2/3 of the cost of operating that truck. And so if we can get those costs down and continue to work on that, as well as work on the sustainability piece of this whole equation, then costs come down, and it's better for everyone in moving these goods around. Next. So as we specifically look at platooning, so the idea with platooning, we've studied and issued a pretty sizable report as it was emerging in 2016, and we're updating this work as we speak now. But in this case, it is along the the evolution that we see could happen with different levels of automation. In this particular situation, both trucks have truck drivers. But they are linked in the acceleration and deceleration with the computer and the safety technologies. So as we looked at this, and I'll get in a minute of some of our findings with our work in platooning, but we saw this fit, from just early automated technologies in that sort of matrix at the bottom there, where the truck driver is being aided in how they're driving the truck with things like automatic braking and lane keeping technologies and warnings, as well as even other things like automated manual shifting and so forth, all the way to what will ultimately be fully autonomous. Next. And so as we look at platooning, the key technology to enable this is those safety equipment. And what we've seen is a pretty dramatic increase in the adoption of automatic braking, lane keeping, predictive cruise control, adaptive cruise control. Those features typically procured by fleets as safety, which then become the enabling technologies to allow this close following distance that we see in the maturity of platooning. And so, we do a study every year looking at adoption of 85 technologies that are efficiency. And so this platooning capable, or these safety technologies, are now on about 2/3 of the new trucks bought by this fleet and really by the industry. So basically the technology is there to do platooning. Next. But it's a pretty challenging piece. So our conclusions in this work is and that's a picture I took of 2 platooning trucks. And that's at about a 50-foot following distance, which is a pretty good sweet spot right now for the early implementation of platooning. Trucks can be safely connected much closer, but it's a level that is a good start. At that gap, and with some assumptions around the % of miles that you could platoon and the effect of congestion and other traveling cars and trucks on the road, if you average the fuel savings of the 2 trucks, it really is a solid 4% savings. And again, as I mentioned, with the high fuel cost, that is, that's a significant number and something that the fleets are very interested in. I would say, though, that there are a good bit of challenges with this. One is the public perception and the acceptance of 2 trucks being closely followed together, maybe not knowing whether or not they're enabled with these technologies. Other issues are where, will one fleet want to platoon with another fleet, even though the technology is there to allow them to do that? And so those operational challenges, interfleet operation, some of those are issues that are in the works for taking advantage of this. Next. And this falls in, and it's kind of a final few comments for me. As I mentioned, this falls into probably an evolution around automating and assisting drivers, and then ultimately finding particular places where an automated truck or a self-driving truck makes a lot of sense, both from the standpoint of safety and cost, and really driver attraction, or attracting drivers to the industry, which is always a challenge in truck driving. So Steve Vasili is a fellow at University of Pennsylvania, and he's done some really interesting work that we have looked at and are studying ourselves, along with interviewing industry players as well as fleets and manufacturers and others around many alternatives to this. So it's possible that we have exit-to-exit automation, where that automated truck never does have to go through traffic lights and stop signs and deal with city traffic. Possibility of drone operation, this and other autonomous opportunities where maybe the driver may not be needed in these trucks. And you think about private yards where there's a lot of confusion and work just moving trailers around, putting them to docks, parking them out away from the facility, and so forth. Some of those can be done with automation much more safely and at lower cost. So the future could include many, if not all, of these different alternatives. And it has a electric truck and alternative fuels aspect to it, where potentially, some of the more urban trucks are electrified, where the range and the air quality are more important, and the longer range might have, continue to use diesel for those long hauls where fuel cell and electric trucks will be challenging. Finally, I offer on the last slide sort of a thought with respect to these costs of operation and this evolution or these different phases, and really we've added one in there, and that's those white tractor trailers where we are discussing an auto follower idea where there's a truck driver in the lead tractor trailer, but the following one could be either what some call a powered trailer or a device that just basically follows that truck driven one, gains some of the benefits. And lastly, as we look at the opportunity with self-driving, that truck can become a 24/7 operation truck, no longer limited by how many hours of service the truck driver can have. And at that point, we really don't need a cab. We don't need a lot of the cost and a lot of the energy consumption that's needed to have a driver in the cab, hoteling and sleeping at night, and on and on. So with that, I appreciate being part of this, NACFE.org. You can reach out to me as well. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mike. Next, we have Molly Cohen-Agostino. She is the policy director for the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. Molly's work spans several sectors and includes environmental policy, community development, and transportation planning. She worked with the California League of Conservation Voters, the City of Oakland's Department of Housing and Community Development, and with the Alameda County Transportation Commission. She carries a master's in public policy from UC Berkeley. And we'll give Molly a moment here to join us. There we go. Welcome, Molly. Molly, we can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for having me.
There we go. You're welcome.
Okay, yeah. And I'll get started. So my name is Molly Cohen-Agostino. I'm the policy director for the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program, followed by my colleague Giovanni. So I won't go into too much detail in this first slide, but please turn to the next slide, please. And we know that three types of transportation and change are coming to transportation. And it can go in many different directions. We'd like to see that this curve that we see on this chart be flattened. So we can flatten the curve for the Three Revolutions, see the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that we know can happen, but that will require both the electrification revolution and a pooling revolution, a shared mobility revolution. So, and I'll just mention that in addition to these greenhouse gas emissions scenarios, we also have a situation where, one of my colleagues recently conducted a modeling exercise, Caroline Rodier. It was an ABM, as Zach described, so I'm glad to have that fantastic introduction. So this comes in within context. But her and her co-authors showed that if in an automated taxi fleet only in San Francisco, there was a significant decline in transit usage, a 50% decline in transit. So in addition to the sort of catastrophic greenhouse gas emission effects of an automated only future, we also would see a reduction in transit and up to an 18% increase in overall vehicle mile of congestion. So certainly significant problems could be ahead if we don't make choices now. So next slide, we'll discuss what other states are doing. So recent research done by my colleague Kelly Fleming showed that Most states have only passed preliminary policies. We use the National Conference of State Legislatures database to identify which policies what other states have done in the way of automation policy. And it's quite interesting to see what has been done, but California is the only state with legislation that addresses AVs and emissions. It's a sort of a small portion of SB 1014 includes automated vehicles when being used for fleet operations. So we do have that policy underway. But there's an urgent policy gap for regulating emissions of potentially privately owned AVs, which we think could be somewhat alarming. This was mentioned by previous panelists and of course Giovanni. But I'll just reiterate that partial automation is already showing increases in VNT, and we have certainly much work to go to create the right policy levers to change that direction. So next slide, we'll talk about some of those policy levers. There's so many to add, it's hard to know which ones to focus, but I've chosen these 4, and so I'll just go through them really quickly. So I think for the CEC, for this audience, I think AV fleet electrification is the most important to underscore. And I think that we need to figure out how to support the clean mile standard that CARB is leading. And the way that the CEC can do that is by working to meet their SB 2127 goals, addressing barriers for AV electrification and charging. Can begin now, because if we begin with addressing the needs of charging for existing fleets, especially for ride-hailing fleets, that may be an easy transition for AVs operating in a fleet. So we think that there's a lot of opportunities there, and it's worth mentioning that CEC's work will have, and of course the next panel is going to speak on PNC electrification. So I think what I'd like to underscore here is that the effort, everything you hear from the next panel it will relate to this effort, because the SB 1014 and the TNC electrification effort in California applies to automated vehicles as well. So I think we need to remember that. But turning quickly to pricing, and of course I could talk for a full 8 minutes on pricing, so I won't, but I will. I think it's important to underscore that there's many different pricing signals, and for the CEC, I think that pricing for fleet access for charging is one of an important metric and an important opportunity. And of course there's some others. There's opportunities to reform the LCFS. Of course that would require legislation, but to encourage more charging hubs and more investments in charging, we need to figure out how to encourage adoption of charging for fleets. So turning quickly to data sharing, again, this is a big topic, so just underscore this is something that's the CPUC is really leading in their AV pilot reform efforts. They've been working on trying to crack the nut on data collection, and I think the CEC should play a role in that to ensure that charging data is also included in the mix. And turning to pooling, I will actually ask you to change to the next slide to talk more about pooling, because pooling is certainly last listed here, but not least. There's a lot going on and a lot of questions that remain about pooling. And one of the questions posed to this panel was, will pooling return? Or will single occupant travel dominate after the pandemic? And I think in order to even have this conversation, I think it's really important to get clear on some definitions. So research recently done by Ken Pirani focused on how we need to understand better our risk definitions. So you can understand safety as being secure from accidental harm, and security being safe from intentional harm. And so what we do is we create these personal risk constellations we can imagine, which are groupings of safety and security risks that can be weighed against benefits to determine behavior. And so these vary by age, gender, et cetera. They're probably much more difficult than our current models can really model. To really determine behavior, we'll have to get a better sense of how we can mitigate these risks. So turning to the next slide, I think the role of the state here, the role of policy, is to try to think through how we can mitigate risks related to the pandemic. Of course, risks for traveling with other strangers are high right now. And so we certainly want to think through what policy solutions could help to mitigate those risks. Is it masks? Is masks alone enough? I'm not answering that question, but I certainly think it's one that we have to ask. Or are there other solutions? AVs introduce new risks and new types of risks, new security and safety risks. And it's up to policymakers to try to identify how they can mitigate those risks. Of course, electrification does reduce the broader externalities associated with driving ICE vehicles. So we certainly want to think about how we can reduce risks there. And I think that when you think about the three revolutions, we can think about different risks and risk constellations that will evolve as safety and security evolves in this space. And I think what bringing it back to equity, and of course we really follow the great work that Green Mining is doing on this. We really need to think about how we can endeavor to address all risks and ensure that there's an equity of risk. So we're not encouraging or requiring risks to be endured by certain sectors of the economy of our communities. So I think with that, I will close. And my next slide is just a thank you, so you can turn to that slide. So thank you so much for having me. And I do look forward to going into more detail in the discussion. So.
Thank you so much, Molly. Our next speaker is Maya Ben-Yor. She has over a decade of global work experience in public, private, and third sector settings focused on clean tech and sustainable transportation. Maya curates and leads the World Economic Forum's Global New Mobility Coalition to advance a synced approach to shared electric and automated mobility for maximizing sustainability of urban transport systems. She also co-leads the forum's AV policy framework work in partnership with Israel's Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Maya holds a PhD in Dynamic Transportation Policy and Technology Transition from Israel Institute of Technology, among several other degrees. Maya, you're welcome to turn your video on and provide your presentation. Thank you.
So hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Commissioner Monahan, and distinguished guests and fellow panelists and participants. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. I represent the World Economic Forum, but also the group that Ben has just described, the Global New Mobility Coalition, that was launched last year at the Sustainable Development Impact Summit. It's a group of over 150 organizations and individuals. 50% are from for-profit and 50% are from non-profit, representing organizations from across the globe, from Asia, from Europe, and from North America. Over to the next slide. This group has come together around a single task, which is to address climate change and other benefits that can emerge as we address climate change. The challenge and opportunity at stake is that we probably will not be able to achieve decarbonization of mobility systems on time if we rely only on electrification. And therefore, we're tapping into research paved by Dan Sterling and team from UC Davis and others, that by thinking shared electric and autonomous mobility, we might be able to achieve that. I won't repeat the numbers that have just been noted by Molly and by Giovanni earlier on. I would comment that this slide is actually a dynamic slide, so I'll describe what you could have seen if this was a PPT format and not a PDF format. And that's that from a global perspective, if we were to adopt electrification and automation, that around 2040, we would be able to see a halt in passenger miles traveled and a decrease in well-to-wheel carbon emissions, even in developing countries such as China. But if we were to adopt the three revolutions, so if we were to add that shared mobility, shared rides into the mix, we can not only achieve that decarbonization earlier, the reduction would be much more significant, threefold from a business as usual. And we would also see a slight reduction, even in developed countries, in passenger mile travel. Over to the next slide. And I want to illuminate some points that were made before on safety. So of course, safety first. And in order for us to achieve that safety and autonomy, autonomous vehicles do need to operate, do need to drive some miles. There are new studies that are showing that shared autonomous vehicles, or SAVs, can actually deliver climate benefits and obviously cost reductions, even if they increase vehicle mile travel in the short term. And that's just important to note. There are a few references here to look at. There are a lot of uncertainties and how people are going to change behavior. And obviously, COVID-19 has presented both threats and opportunities. But it is important for regulators to note that mobility as a service, or autonomous vehicle as a service, is going to be key for us to enable that transition from single occupancy rides and from high passenger vehicle miles into a more sustainable commute set of choices, and as well as delivery choices. So we have to recognize that autonomy happens on various nodes in various segments, long haul and short haul and urban mobility. And I want to note that LA, for example, is now developing a framework for regulating its skies to enable drone delivery together with the World Economic Forum. And we're also seeing countries like Japan stating that autonomy is going to be bundled with mobility as a service to serve underpopulated areas that it is struggling to serve. And over to the next slide. One very important point is that if we were to look at shared electric and autonomous mobility, or what we call SIM, it is clearly that if we were to think of the best case for us to electrify first, that would probably be shared electric autonomous vehicles, or shared autonomous, so TNCs or pooled rides, that I understand is going to be articulated in the next session. These high mileage vehicles are extremely important, and we should think about how we can tackle the specific use cases that were described by companies like Cruise, to make sure that we are achieving the most out of our investments in the near future. And it is through two dimensions that we might be able to do that. So it is up to us linking between public action and private action and hybrid action. So a lot of coordination and collaboration is needed. On this side, on the bottom right-hand side, you can see that some countries have already tackled that by establishing authorities that are combining few institutions and looking at various jurisdictions, and are already working closely with academia and the industry as they think about long-term autonomous vehicle policies and frameworks, moving beyond the safety elements of autonomous mobility and preparing for commercial utilization of autonomy. And we also need to note that we should leverage these cost and space instrumentations that we have, either at the national level, at the regional level, and at the local and city level, to be able to do that, and that it has to be context oriented. And therefore, a lot of deep dive into what constitutes a good investment in a specific city to enable the acceleration of shared autonomous vehicles that are electric is key. And there is obviously no silver bullets to adopt. It actually has to happen through these collaborative efforts. Over to the next slide, please. So some of the well-designed packages of policy instruments that we've been looking at have been those that listed here. We've conducted a bit of a survey among our members to see how different regimes, different parts of the world might perceive policy instruments. And it's not surprising that actually a lot of the policy tools that are found to be impactful and feasible are similar. And our group actually is now doubling down on three specific policy areas. One is road pricing, the other one is looking at the CARB and street level and how do you regulate access and provision pricing, preferential pricing to shared electric and autonomous vehicles. And the third one is looking at strategic charging and management areas in prime locations in cities to be able to serve those vehicles that are operating around the clock. And whereas pooled rides currently driven by humans can drive that much, autonomous vehicles can obviously operate in much greater efficiency, but there is that risk of deadheading, and in order to address that risk that was stated earlier on, we do have to make sure that the system, the physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure is enabling a seamless operation that is trying to make the best out of the tools we have, the modes we have, and be more purpose-oriented to make sure that we're avoiding these unnecessary miles and maximizing the usage of each mode that we have on the ground. Over to the next slide, please. COVID-19 obviously presents opportunities and threats, and we touched a bit, and other panelists have touched a bit about that as well. I think that a few points to make in relation to autonomous vehicles and the potential of the shared electric and autonomous vehicle adoption is first, I would say, safety. So all mobility users are now considered vulnerable. And then because of that, we can now adopt a lot of technologies, data, ICT, and so on, to accelerate the transition to a smarter mobility system that would benefit autonomy and would benefit shared mobility systems as well. And my time is up, so I'm going to wrap up here. I don't have much more to add, but I'm looking forward to discussing with you in the panel.
Maya, thank you so much for your presentation. That concludes all of our the panelists' presentation portion of our panel. I want to invite the dais, Commissioner Monahan, and others to ask any questions of the panelists at this time.
Great, thank you. Fascinating panel. And I have to say, just as a woman in transportation, it's really nice to see all these women. Mike, you're like the lone guy. How often does that happen? I don't know. Never?
First time ever.
So, yeah, it just like warms my heart. For a long time, I would be the only woman, and then people would call me and say, please join my panel. We need a woman. so this is wonderful. And you all dealt with a lot of topics that are near and dear to my heart too, which is, you know, I'm losing my headset. How do we move forward with a clean transportation system that benefits everyone? You know, I think what Mike was talking about in terms of the opportunity for these technologies to reduce emissions from heavy-duty transportation, which I think has a lot of equity implications right there. And you know, as we think through how do we address the racism that is both historic and I would say remains pandemic in our society, and create the transportation system that we want to see, which benefits everyone, and especially disadvantaged communities and communities that have trouble, you know, just accessing mobility generally. So I had one question actually specific to Nadia, and then a general question for the panel. The question specific to Nadia is, I was fascinated to hear that Cruise is thinking about owning the charging infrastructure, which I did not know. And that is pretty close to the model that we're seeing in China with Didi, which is their big ride-hailing company, that where they're using they're calling it their orange technology, where they're going to have like their app tells drivers when to go charge, they go charge, they actually have like a food service, and they have all these elaborate plans actually to make it sort of a nice place to rest. And I'm curious if you could share your thoughts about what that charging system would look like for Cruise.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question, and I will say that it's still like very evolving because we're only in the testing stage right now. So our charging system currently is that we own the chargers, and we operate them in order to support the vehicles that are out testing on the road. While cars are getting charged, they're also getting maintenance done, and we're doing all the facilities and checks. So we have people working on the vehicles as well before they go out to test. I think in a model where we are scaled, there'll be more sites around where we own and operate the stations in order to support the vehicles that we have out on the road. So I think there's tons of opportunity there for us to explore ways that we can, better integrate with the grid, that we can support the vehicles that we have out there, that we also can see if there are any other ways that we can align with some of the programs that both the Commission is thinking and others who are operating in this space.
Great to hear. And at some point, maybe we could follow up and do a tour of what, I'd love to see it firsthand. So when there isn't it, actually to see.
Absolutely. We'd love to have you.
So my question for the group is this question about equity. And you all have touched on it in different ways. I was curious, Maya, when you were talking about how you're looking at this as a big opportunity to advance equity and advance mobility. And yet we've heard some horror stories too around how these technologies would make it more difficult to create an equitable transportation system. So I wonder if you all have, you've given us some general guidance on equity, but if you have specific guidance for what we can do in the state of California, I guess in addition to what Hannah pointed out in terms of making sure that we are integrating, hearing what community needs are and really responding to those needs. So it's a system that is definitely bubbled up from the community rather than being imposed on the community. But are there other ways we could think about using our policy levers to advance equitable transportation solutions?
I'm happy to chime in with a couple of examples. So we're seeing, what I noted in my presentation was the case of Japan, where they have an older population that is just underserved. There are no mobility services in areas in Japan just because the public mobility system has been privatized in the 70s and there's just not enough demand to operate. And one of the things that they've done, they've really looked at what would serve, how can these people be served best? And they've thought about technologies that would help to leapfrog some of the challenges as well. So for example, polls in the streets where people can just push a button and then a vehicle would know where they need to go. So, a lot of surveys, a lot of field work, and a lot of testing, experimentation. And I think a few panelists here also noted too, how do you experience or letting more of the public experience certain solutions. But I would also note that obviously we all agree, right, that automation on its own would probably not be beneficial for equity. And we do need to make sure that when automation hits the ground and being commercialized, it actually is capable of of serving as many at a low cost. And for that to happen, we need to make sure that the economics are there. And this is why I think tuning into what these operators, these autonomous vehicle or novel autonomous vehicle companies such as Cruise and Zoox and others that are looking, and Waymo and others, that are looking at a shared mobility operation model, what is it that would make it possible for them to start with sharing and not start with serving individuals? And that economics relates to these needs, such as operating a fleet, having access to prime locations in cities, having a charging infrastructure that makes sense for them, that would enable them to maximize the benefits of each vehicle that they operate. And there needs to be a lot of coordination in order for us to be able to serve that need. And obviously zero emission zones and other perspectives or other approaches to more sustainable and equitable urban development can be very useful.
I can jump in here. So I think specific to California, the mobility equity framework has really helped to influence the design and development of some innovative clean mobility pilots coming out of CARB, mainly clean mobility options in disadvantaged communities and the sustainable transportation equity pilot. And so these are all community-driven mobility solutions where residents are actively co-creating and deciding which mobility options meet their needs. And I know the Energy Commission is also exploring and funding some of these kinds of pilots, and I think we need a lot more of this. But I think we have to even think beyond the pilots themselves, and we need those marginalized folks to be deeply involved in shaping what those equitable guidelines should look like. And I think, of course, there's endless different policy interventions. You know, there's road pricing, making sure services are accessible, retraining programs and whatnot. But there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all solution, and it will look very different in each community. And so personally, like, I'm less concerned about the specifics of the policy interventions, and I'm more interested in the process of how we get there, and how marginalized folks are involved in self-determination of their communities and deciding what those appropriate policy interventions are. And so our framework has also been used and adapted to help determine what are those most equitable, most appropriate policy interventions, specifically on the topic of community-driven congestion pricing policies in San Francisco and Portland. And we're now also adapting it to the context of studying zero emissions.
You know, one quick thought from a freight perspective, you know, wasn't so long ago that, you know, the packages came home with the person. So we were with a car and they went shopping and they brought home the packages. Now, no longer can we look at freight as this separate thing in our communities and in the subdivisions and, you know, in downtowns. I mean, it is e-commerce and even COVID, with so many people having meals delivered, food delivered. So now those packages, or those smaller goods movement, are now very much like a people movement. And so we have to consider both of them when we look at all these technologies and policies and practices, because it's very similar.
Dan, do you have any questions for the panel?
Yes, I always have questions. You know, first of all, I want to reinforce what Hannah just said and Maya about, you know, especially the idea of how do we develop these innovative services in a way that really do serve communities, and especially all communities, but especially disadvantaged communities. And, you know, we're launching all these pilot projects, and some of them are with a lot of input, some of them with less input. But even more crucially, we haven't created the permanent funding streams and the permanent policies to actually make them, you know, reality and scale up and stick around. And I think there's a role for the Energy Commission as well as CARB and others to really get focused on that part of it. So that's really a top priority. I have a little question for Mike and a bigger question for Nadia. So Mike, you said the platooning would save 4% energy. So I just wanted to understand that better. So was that for 2 trucks platooned, one is 50 feet behind, and that's the saving for the second one? Or is that averaged for the 2? What is that 4% number?
Yeah, that's a straightforward question. I appreciate that. So we reviewed dozens. I think we're up to like 40 different tests that were provided to us, both by manufacturers, by fleets, and other things for these two truck platooning. Some were on empty freeways or not empty test tracks, I should say, where it's just the 2 trucks running, and others were more in traffic. So basically what happens is when these 2 trucks are alone at highway speeds, the following truck can save pretty consistently around 10%, and the front truck around 4.5%. So if you combine those 2 savings and the amount of fuel being burned by both of them, it's about a 7% savings. But no way can you platoon every mile. There's going to be miles where each truck is going to be separate. And then ultimately, there's going to be times where either construction, weather, general congestion caused that platoon to break up. So we did some analysis and some work to look at, okay, well, how much of that 7% in that perfect case of 2 trucks alone at highway speed, how much of that goes away? And of course, it's very, it changes much, but around a 4% average between the 2 trucks. And then, the second follow-on question often is, well, if the front truck's saving less than the back truck, then why would I ever want to be in front? And how will 2 fleets, figure that out? And when we asked the CFOs of these carriers, they all said, hey, we'll figure that out. We know which truck's behind for how many miles, which truck's ahead for how many miles, and we'll figure out the monetary movement of money from one fleet to another per truck. And they didn't see that as a real problem.
And a little bit follow up on that. If those are battery electric or fuel cell electric trucks, would that number change? I mean, I understand there's some problems with diesel engines, you know, getting enough air, like in the second truck and platooning and so on.
Yeah, if you get too close, then, you know, there's not enough cooling air for the following truck. So you have that right. You know, really it's basically the same. We're talking about energy. And so whether it's electric or whether it's diesel, that savings is going to be there. When we look at an electric truck, you know, the more efficient electric trucks, so the more miles you can go, it ends up being a range enhancer, even more so than a you know, a cost savings because of the fuel savings. So that's why these electric trucks need to be as efficient as possible, because every efficiency gain will get more miles of range, which will really be important.
Yeah, you know, I would just comment, we really need to get our act together in the policy world to figure out how we're going to deal with truck platooning. It's not an obvious. And then, so my other question is just for Nadia. So you said you're going to produce these Cruise Origins vehicles, which, by the way, are I think the ideal 3 revolution vehicles. I love them. But you said when the time is ripe. Can you define for us what that means? What conditions have to exist before GM would actually roll out, would pull the trigger and scale up?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a number of things under consideration. What I didn't share, and if you haven't read the press releases or any of the things online, is that the Origin is campfire seating on the inside. So redesign the total inside where there's not a steering wheel, there aren't any pedals, and that there's campfire seating, meaning rows where people can face each other, and a little bit of modularity inside of the vehicle. So one big hurdle is the fact that it's not legal via FMVSS to have cars without steering wheels and pedals out on the road. Like, they're capped at a certain limit. And so making for the regulatory environment to kind of continue to evolve and be able to think about moving towards that way. I think the other piece is that we are still we're in the testing phase. So we haven't gotten to the phase where we are fully deploying the vehicles. The regulatory environment is also still evolving. And so those things need to get into place before the vehicle like an Origin can get out on the road, because it is so novel and new and forward-leaning.
Not fully satisfying, but thank you.
Are these vehicles being tested, Nadia? Where are they being tested? I know San Francisco. Where else?
So the Origin is not being tested. What's on the road now are the Chevy Bolt. And so those are being tested in San Francisco.
So the Origin is a concept, but it hasn't actually gone on the road to be.
Yes.
Am I getting
this right? It's a little bit more than that. So the terminology is a little tricky. So people, when they say concept or prototype, it's like a pie in the sky idea that is designed. It's not ready for production. Like, the parts, the equipment, the engineers haven't totally figured out how to kind of totally put it together. With the Origin, all those things are complete. So it's more than a prototype, but it's not actually rolling off the production lines just yet. It's ready to, meaning that we have the know-how to be able to do it. We have all the parts and equipment to be able to do it. It's just not being produced currently or actively.
Great, thank you. So I'm ready to turn it over to Ben for facilitating questions, unless, Dan, do you have any other questions before the facilitated session?
I'm fine.
Okay, great. All right, looking forward to the discussion. We'll pop off video.
Thank you, Commissioner Monahan and Dr. Sperling. Really appreciate those questions. So just a reminder to the panel, we're scheduled to wrap this up at about 12:10. So we've got about 20 minutes or so for a couple of questions. We've addressed a lot already thus far, but I am going to ask the COVID question because I think that's one we haven't quite touched on and elaborated. So I'll throw this out to the whole panel. Feel free to jump in. Is there a concern about automation as a service in light of new attitudes towards physical distancing? How might COVID-19 affect traveler interest, comfort in automated ride sharing in the long term?
So, I mean, I definitely agree we have to think about ride sharing in the context of public health safety and opportunity. I'll let someone else handle that part, but I really do want to use it as an opportunity to expand on Molly's point earlier about, we have to think about ride sharing in the context of personal security for vulnerable populations. And while I fully agree, yes, we have to be moving more towards shared trips, we really have to acknowledge that this comes along with inherent safety inequities. And so in the context of vehicle sharing, it's so different for women, people of color, children, immigrants, and all these other groups who are constantly targeted and harassed on transit and in shared rides. I myself have been in really uncomfortable situations in shared rides. And also, I mean, with today, the increase in racist attacks, we really can't ignore this. And not everyone is going to feel comfortable sharing an AV with total strangers, especially without that third-party driver. And, I've heard countless horror stories, but the reality is that only certain groups experience them, and it's often not the folks who are developing the technology or developing the policies or the research scopes. And so if we want to see that kind of massive shift into AV sharing, we can't just talk about the modeling in terms of, efficiency and sustainability. And we have to design shared vehicles in a way that everyone feels safe to increase accessibility. And so I have an example, an idea for Nadia. I would love to see designated vehicles and fleets that are female only at night. Like that would instantly increase like my, ability to ride them. But my last point, I'll just wrap up quick, is that we have to think about what safety enforcement looks like in this automated future. Because we know that Uber and Lyft have had huge issues with addressing sexual harassment in their services. And also, I mean, today with the spotlight on police terror, how can we develop forms of AV safety enforcement that moves away from policing and instead towards these community-based violence prevention models? I definitely do not have all the answers to reconciling these safety inequities, and my recommendation to figure out those equitable solutions is to really start these conversations with engaging those most vulnerable folks.
I would like to jump in and maybe follow up a bit on what Hannah said. And I think that we have an opportunity here actually to look at shared rides or high occupancy vehicles more holistically. So the issues that are experimented by us women and by various groups in the population in shared rides are also applicable to the broader set or the traditional set of shared rides, which is transit. So there is an opportunity for these various agents, various operators, the more traditional shared mobility operators and the new shared mobility operators to come together and help construct some sort of guidelines and if needed, even implement technologies in cabin if needed or on app or whatnot to make sure that we're actually operating right. And of course, enforcement will be very much needed. So that I would say, we are presented with an opportunity to break down these barriers. And with COVID, we've seen these barriers break down already. We've seen buses in Wuhan take groceries and essential goods to places, and we've seen the other way around. We've seen the usage of shared mobility to be able to compensate for public transit that could not operate at night because there was just too little demand, and transporting people in Florida from hospitals back to their homes. So there is that great opportunity to look more holistically at the problem of equity, at the problem of shared mobility. But to your question on biosafety, and is that going to be a hurdle or not? I think it's too soon to say. I think it's great that teleworking is an option for some, but only for some. And I think it should be addressed. And we see in some places in the world where it's appropriate, where it's possible, we see these new technologies emerge. We see Didi doing few in-app changes to require drivers to implement some in-vehicle features to be able to protect their riders. And we see in-app features that are requiring drivers to film themselves, clean the vehicle, and to show that they're actually wearing a mask. And in Australia, we see the government coming up with an app that is implementing all across to make sure that if somebody was exposed, it's communicated to others. And we see ride-hailing companies, we see shared mobility providers partnering with authorities to detect or to communicate to people that might have been exposed, and share that information. So there is that great opportunity to break down all of these barriers of data exchanges, of public-private divides, and all sorts of other silos that we've created in a 20th century mobility system, and move onwards and try to solve these issues together rather than in silos. It's just my proposal here.
Yeah, I actually wanted to jump in on that as well and talk a little bit about not only what was like raised by Hannah and Maya when it comes to how you're interacting with and making sure that all the voices are at the table, but also thinking about how you design it for the most vulnerable in our populations. I too fall into that category of being in that double minority of sorts, and thinking about like what my needs and what the needs of my community are. And that if done right, you can deploy and think about, shared rides, autonomous vehicles, electrification in a way that is more like inclusive and is able to sort of chip away at the systemic racism and issues that we are facing as a society today. I think the other side of that is that the outbreak of COVID-19 and this new consciousness, for lack of a better word, that America specifically is in the middle of when it comes to the disparities and situations that many people face, gives us a big opportunity to do things differently, and also gives us the space to be able to do things differently. When speaking specifically about like self-driving cars and electric vehicles based on the outbreak of COVID, what we've seen like anecdotally is people are looking to see if it's a way for it to be more of a solution. We talk about delivery, contactless delivery, being able to like redeploy fleets in a different way that may not have been what was initially concepted, but because you're in this new environment, you now have to think about those things. What I've learned from my time in tech is that people in tech like to solve hard problems. So now when you're thinking about COVID and reducing the spread and mitigating its impact, especially on those communities that are now being shown in the data to be most vulnerable, it's an opportunity for new ideas to be created. We've seen in public transit new cleaning processes and systems that are being put in place. We're seeing people with their own vehicles thinking about ways to be able to clean and innovate. And it also goes across society to like grocery stores and any type of public interaction. And so I can imagine the AV industry thinking about this in a very similar way, figuring out what is needed in order to make this a safe experience, not only when it comes to the public health concerns, but also to the racial epidemic that we have out there, people experiencing racism in different ways. I think for us, it is acknowledging that it's something to focus on and then being able to think about it in a very measured and intentional way in order to be able to make sure that we are able and in a position to do it right.
Yeah, really great points from all the panelists, and I just want to echo what everyone said, but I think I'll add, I think, so of course there's concerns about sharing are going to linger as a result of the pandemic, and I think that those concerns are going to vary based on, lots of criteria, right? Lots of people, Black and brown people especially, feel vulnerable around other groups, and those concerns are only made more visible in recent months. I think that we need to think about what that means for automation, because the CPUC raised this concern during their discussion about how to expand the AV pilot. Right? They thought that you need an adult in the room, and there was a lot of discussion that there are some solutions that can solve that problem. Right? There can be a remote operator. There can be large windows. There can be there can be systems in place that can group individuals by preference, right? If you prefer to ride only with other females, can that be something that operators could include? I think from a policy perspective, I don't think that it's up to the regulators to necessarily make those kind of decisions about what types of services are going to be offered, but there could be incentives that could push them in the right direction. And ensure that that large fleets do have these types of options, and that makes people feel more safe and more secure. This research, there is some research from my colleagues at UC Davis that looked at vehicle design, looked at how we could design vehicles to encourage sharing and make people feel more safe and more comfortable. And I think that is a really important pursuit. Angela Sanguinetti and Ken Karani were involved in that research, and Beth Ferguson in the design school. And they really envisioned a new type of vehicle. And it doesn't look so different from some of the prototypes out there, but I think we need to think about policy levels that may push the whole industry in the right direction, because there may be some good actors, some good companies that do think about these issues, but there also could be some companies that aren't thinking about them and need a push in the right direction. And then the last thing I'll say on this topic is I think that in addition to users of automated vehicles, we have to think about users outside of the vehicle. This is not exactly COVID related, but I think it's important to follow on. Because, well, in addition to people inside the vehicle, you'll have non-users like bicycles, pedestrians, and folks in other vehicles that also have additional security and safety risks. And I think we need to consider for those while we're having this discussion as well, because as automated vehicle matures, those users those non-users, are also needing voice. And so I think those interactions with shared electric automated vehicles will need consideration too. So I think those are the points I'd like to add to this conversation.
Thank you for all of those thoughtful responses. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll allow all the panelists to have about a 30-second final thought before we conclude. So with that, we heard some discussion about the transit sector and the impact of automation on transit operations, particularly in California. So I think it's important that we have a short conversation about that. How do we, as policymakers at the state and others at the local and regional level, make sure that automation isn't a threat to the transit sector, especially at a time when we're seeing ridership decline? How do we use automation to boost and enhance public transit? And looks like Molly's reconnecting. So Maya, maybe you can share some thoughts on the international perspective, and then we can dive in to others.
Sure. I was actually considering if I should emphasize that in some parts of the world, actually autonomous buses are of the first to be tested. So in Rotterdam, there is actually an autonomous bus in a dedicated lane operating for quite some time now. Same goes from Singapore, that is also picking up passengers to enable them to experience the model. Same for Vienna. So we have autonomous buses operating all over. And the promise for that concept of a transition from BRT to ART I think is very interesting. And we should be looking at how can we create a bus system or a transit system that operates through grids where possible. And a lot of the design of cities in the US is actually grid-based. So you can have people transition between modes more often, but then have autonomous transit systems operating more efficiently on lines. And obviously the on-demand dynamic aspect of it is extremely important, but quite difficult to implement because of that point of vulnerable road users and because of that point of wanting to make more space for people to move through active and micromobility and less space for motorized vehicles. So there is a bit of a tension there, but I would also illuminate to NACTO's Urbanism Next white paper that also articulates some of these potential benefits for transit systems if automation actually sees light. So just to, I don't know if I've covered that, but that's one perspective to think of.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I mean, we also just need huge investments to improve the quality and the service of mass transit to make sure that it actually stays competitive with other forms of mobility, and have to make it a good option for people. And, you know, I don't think we should give up so quickly on the idea that government can't be innovative. Like, you look around the world at what other governments are doing, and I mean, it's absolutely possible. And if, you know, government did invest in autonomously driven public transit, I think they'd actually be better positioned to ensure equitable access, you know, pricing models, sustainability, to guarantee fair labor standards and just transition programs for displaced drivers. And I mean, to be honest, yeah, if government and transit agencies don't innovate and don't keep up with other mobility services, then they're at risk of, you know, going the way that the taxi did.
Yeah, I think, again, I agree so much with what's been said, but I just want to underscore that the transit operators are really in trouble. And you know, I'm really, you know, speaking on behalf of myself, but also this is something that I've heard Dan say a ton of times. And of course, Dan, you're the architect of the 3 revolutions. And and Patty, of course, as well. So I know you all know this and know this topic really well, but I think what's important to recognize here when we're talking about the transit impacts of automated vehicles and not transit impacts writ large, because of course that's a huge discussion. But when we're talking about the risk of how automation will affect transit, we know that it's a lot about costs, and the service, if shared automated service really comes online, it will be cost competitive with transit, and that will be another blow to transit operation and really reduce ridership again. So we need to really think about how we can reform transit from being, this quote is so difficult, but the transit currently it's taking you from where you're not to where you're not going, right? So how do we make transit to be more on demand, to be more responsive, and whether that includes automation or not, I think is really it remains to be seen, and it remains to be needed. What we do know is that many operators will probably transition towards an adult in the room, and where we do see low-speed automated shuttles, we do have safety operators on board, right? So we're not in a position where we're comfortable with allowing a many-seater vehicle having no adult in the room, and that may linger. So the safety, the savings, the cost savings associated with removing the driver may not actually be there. The question is then, can that driver provide other services and meet other needs of riders? And that's a discussion that we've had for many years. How can the driver, in theory, be transitioned to remove some of their driving tasks, maybe not all, depending on the safety of the situation, to then provide other services, whatever that may be. I'm not suggesting that they become hairstylists or, but they may be able to deliver some types of services to people on board. So I think we need to think creatively about how we can transition transit operations to deliver some service in an automated way.
Yeah, and just to also close out I guess on one of the last panelists to talk on the transit piece, I think it's an important and a big question. It's also worth thinking about the balance between it, going to the focus of specifically self-driving cars and the interaction with transit. I think there is an opportunity for self-driving cars to be a complement, and by a complement, not only meaning first last mile to connect people to transit systems as they're continuing to be built out, but also being able to design an experience for people based on their unique needs. A lot of times the transit and bus schedules are designed for the majority of the population when they need to get from somewhere based on, peak rush hour times, the traditional 9 to 5 schedule. I think when looking at self-driving cars, there's an opportunity to think about the ways that they can help folks who may not be on that same schedule or may be a little bit more rigid in their time to be able to get from where they need to go to where they need to be, and that they can work hand in hand, and it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game when you think about self-driving cars out on the road with transit. I definitely am live to and appreciate the situation that transit is in currently because of the COVID outbreak, and also thinking about the ways that, it can be more in collaboration or done in tandem with some of those innovative technologies that are coming there. And again, making sure that the person is in the loop and that people, that self-determination piece is there, that you're not only saying to certain people that you have to rely on transit, this is your only way of getting around, but saying here are a suite of options that you can choose from depending on what's happening in your day and your life that allows you to be able to maintain the level of mobility that you need and that you desire at that period of time. So I think it's definitely a big conversation, definitely ongoing. And I think by doing this and having conversations where people can talk about how those things can interact and exist in the same larger system is the way that we get there.
All right, thank you so much. So unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions, but I am going to give all of you 30 seconds to have some closing thoughts. I'm going to go in the order in which you all gave presentations earlier. So Hannah, you're first.
I guess I just want to close out by connecting this equity and community engagement conversation to these research conversations, because there's so much excellent research now coming out about equity implications and so many amazing researchers who, I follow your work and I very much respect you all. But I think, as we're seeing, all of this funding going towards equity research, we need really clear guidelines on how to keep accountable to meeting those equity outcomes. And so I just want to make a quick plug for a document that Greenlining is developing and that we'd love feedback on from researchers to collect a range of best practices, equity resources, and recommendations for researchers who are conducting equity work. And this isn't just specific to academia. This could be applied to the private sector conducting their own research and other NGOs as well. So just wanted to make that plug and connection, because we can't really, foster these kinds of conversations without building equity in from the beginning, including research.
Thank you. Nadia?
Yeah, I want to close out by double clicking on the importance of having these types of dialogues and conversations, but also figuring out ways that we can collaborate and work together. I think we all have diverse perspectives that we bring not only to our day jobs, but based on our experiences and what our passions and interests are. And I think we all are working to solve some things that are really, really hard and challenging that are out there. I think we should all look at this as an opportunity to be able to fix some of the things that we know is wrong, not only with our systems, but how we think about and approach problems. And then also giving ourselves a little bit of grace to work through some of those things that may be a little bit more thorny or challenging, but also working towards the goal and keeping ourselves accountable to the desire and the vision and the future that we all say that we want to see so badly. And also just a thank you for allowing us to be here and join the conversation and contribute and share our thoughts. So looking forward to keeping this going in any way, shape, or form.
Go ahead, Mike.
So, I was asked to join on highway trucks and platooning, and, I think it's important to consider all of our options around electric and hydrogen fuel cell possibly that are in other forums, as well as automation. But, having spent the hour talking really about urban, I just think it's really important to think about freight and think about the package delivery, the goods delivery in our cities with parking challenges, with a lot of what we've talked about here. So just bringing freight into those urban mobility transportation discussions, whether it's automation, electric, or even shared. I mean, someone mentioned, using buses to move goods or potentially trucks to move people or something of that nature, or light rail. So there's a shared aspect of goods and people that I think should be really important in a lot of these conversations in cities and states around the country.
Great, and then we'll do Molly and Maya.
Well, I think this, I think to close, once again, I'll thank Dan, Giovanni, and Patty, for all of their work in this space. I think this is a really fantastic conversation, and all the other panelists have really learned a lot from you, so thank you. I'll just reiterate what has been said. There's a large body of research pointing to, some concerns related to AV travel, right? And we want the commission to recognize those concerns, and we want to ensure that we can do our best to mitigate pressures for increased vehicle miles, increased emissions associated with the coming tide of automation, and I think we can do that. So we've got policy mechanisms to do it with. We've got SB 1014, the Clean Mile Standard, that's going to be discussed in the next session, and I think that the CEC can work to develop charging infrastructure and meet their SB 2127 goals, and really target those on high mileage vehicles like EVs. And I think so. And then of course there's a number of other policies that are already on the books that offer us tools to help meet the needs of AV travel, including SB 375. We need to work to empower regions and cities to plan to mitigate risk associated with AV travel. As well as other policies. So I'll close there, but thank you again for having me, and I think let's continue this conversation.
Thank you so much as well for having me. So many great final remarks here. I'll just maybe highlight two things. One is that we are presenting with an opportunity to actually realize that resilient mobility system for moving both people and goods or things is one that is multimodal. So perhaps we should give up that 20th century segmentation between modes and think about the opportunity of putting the externalities of private cars and other externalities of a mobility system in the way we think about how we price, how we provision access, and so on. And that's where governments can play a huge role. And the second point is that each one of us is going to experience different needs of mobility throughout our lives. It's not just that different people have different needs. The same person throughout their lives would have different needs. So we have to be, wearing different lenses as we think about that as users as well of mobility systems, and be agile and be flexible and make sure that all of these various options are available for everyone. And that can only happen if there is actually a robust financing or business case for each of these models. So it's not or this or that. If we want to be truly multimodal, we have to make sure that all of these are complementary and operable from a business perspective. And that calls for a lot of more conversations like this one, and maybe having a bit more players, business players in the conversation as well. Thank you so much.
That concludes our panel. Thank you all. I really appreciate your time and the thoughtful discussion we had today. I'll turn it over to Heather.
Great. Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the panelists for sharing your time and expertise. That's just so helpful and interesting. So it is time to move on to public comments, and I'll just remind folks to please limit to one person per organization, and we'll have time 3 minutes per person. And if you're on Zoom online, just go ahead and press the raise hand icon to let us know that you'd like to comment. And if you change your mind, you can press that icon again, and it'll take your hand down. And if you're on the phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand. And with that, I will introduce Rosemary Avalos from the Public Advisor's Office of the Energy Commission to go ahead and help us with that public comment period. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I will first call on attendees using the raised hand features on Zoom. Please state your name and affiliation and spell your first and last name. Also, do not use the speakerphone feature because we may not be able to hear you clearly. Robert Perry, your line is open and you may need to unmute on your end.
Yeah, hi, my name's Robert Perry, R-O-B-E-R-T-P-E-R-R-Y. I'm the principal consultant for a firm called Synergistic Solutions, which is a policy consultancy firm. And I just want to thank the panelists. This has been a fantastic conversation. And I would just like to comment on some of the socio-political aspects of what we're trying to achieve. And I think the panel kind of touched on a lot of these different aspects when they're talking about security and prioritization and things like that. And I really think that what we're dealing with is we have to kind of acknowledge what the current ideal is. And in this country, the ideal is absolute autonomy through personal car ownership. I think there's an expectation that you have your car, you can get it in whenever you want, go wherever you want, and the only constraining factors are fuel and congestion. And we have to develop a system that can deliver on most of the expectations towards that ideal, and while giving an alternative lifestyle that is acceptable and maybe even preferable. And I think there are a couple of things that have to be accomplished in order to do that. One, I think we need a unified platform on which all the apps for these various transit and transportation services are located. I think people have to be able to go to a portal and access all a wide menu of things, and based on their preferences, be given various services that will get them from point A to point B. I think a prerequisite to that is there's going to have to be a major advance in information infrastructure. I think the telecommunications companies have to be brought to task to make significant improvements so that there is seamless integration as far as communication as people go from one transportation mode to another. And third, I think there needs to be a prioritization system that accurately assesses the person's need to get to their end destination. I think COVID has given us a window as to what truly essential is, what truly essential is, and that system will give a higher prioritization to a sanitation worker who needs to get to work to get on their truck to pick up the trash than to the CEO of a company who is basically operating mostly online and doesn't really have to physically get anywhere, provided that he has that interconnection. And I think that finally, that we need to explore, people are going to have to develop user profiles on their preferences, in that we might engage the dating services and the compatibility processes to match riders better, so that there are not any altercations. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. And a reminder, dial *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute if you're on the phone. Are there any other comments? Please raise your hand. Okay, we have David Park. Your line is unmuted, and please spell your first and last name and your affiliation.
Hi, this is
David Park.
David. Yep, David Park. Last name is spelled P-A-R-K. I'm with the California Fuel Cell Partnership. I'm the industry liaison. Just two very brief observations to offer to the panel and to Commissioner Monahan. Thank you very much for having this really valuable session. It was very interesting on the CARB had a pathway to carbon neutral society webinar yesterday, and a big dominating topic on that was energy storage and the role of hydrogen in energy storage. And I'd just like to point out that as society moves towards electric drive train transportation, this provides dual benefit in that hydrogen can be used directly in the transportation network, and then it also can be useful in grid stability. And then secondly, on the equity side, we're seeing now fuel cell electric vehicles on the light duty side launched in around 2015. And we're seeing those vehicles returning from their original owners or leasers and being put back into the market at a significant cost reduction. And when it gets to high density housing, accessibility of centralized hydrogen refueling is somewhat more convenient than installing land-based electricity for large populations of electric vehicle users. And then finally, on the light duty, heavy duty, medium duty side, on the scaling side, we note that all of these vehicle classes have a synergistic effect on each other in that as the light duty market scales, it reduces the cost of fuel cell power plants that can then be installed at cost effectively into the heavy duty sector. And then as the heavy, medium, and heavy duty sectors scale, they're vastly larger consumers of hydrogen per vehicle. And so then we see economies of scale on the fuel costs, hydrogen fuel cost side. So we do see a total market picture on that. Thanks for listening to my comment.
Thank you, Mr. Park. Seeing there are no raised hands, this concludes public comments. I turn to Commissioner Monahan.
Sure. Well, thanks everybody for participating. I really appreciate this morning panel. It's really a fascinating discussion, gives us lots of food for thought. I encourage folks to return for the afternoon session, which is on electrifying transportation network companies. So we'll have I'm sure, a really great panel discussion there too. So hope you can join. Thanks everybody.